Mandy was really outgoing. She was an amazing person. She taught me how to ride bikes, and we played dolls and went on trips to Tennessee.
Mandy was very quirky. She was always being funny, being more silly than funny. You know what I mean? She always tried to make you laugh. That was how she came across. She had a real personality. My grandfather was a pastor of our local church. We went to church. It was like Wednesday night Bible study, Saturday night, choir practice, Sunday morning service, night service. So that was a big part of our weeks.
You had to make sure you lived by the Bible. If you didn't, it was a sin.
Paul LeMay met Mandy online. They met on Facebook. Paul LeMay came down to Eastern Kentucky by way of Massachusetts. I think Paul was very smitten by Mandy. I think he was very attracted to the idea that a woman so far away wanted him, and that's what precipitated his relocation to Eastern Kentucky.
The trouble was, she knew nothing of him.
Paul was older. He was 47 or 48. He'd already lived life, so in her mind, she thought he was smarter about things.
Mandy liked that he was different, not from around here. Paul would come every other weekend to come take her to church.
Paul was portrayed to me as a religious person and a good guy. He was this big Christian guy who was really nice. I was happy for her. She had said that they had things in common, that they could actually talk to each other for a long time. She seemed happy, and that made me happy.
They dated about 7 months at the most. And then they got married.
From what she had told me, the reason she married Paul so quick was because they were trying to do things right. It was just a little small wedding, just a few people from that church that they went to.
It was a 15-minute ceremony. It wasn't nothing fancy. My grandparents thought it was a good thing, too, to get married to Paul. They liked that he had a job to provide for her and had 2 vehicles.
Paul didn't have much family nearby. None of his family was there, I know that. Looking back, that was very weird to me. I've personally never met none of Paul's family.
Paul LeMay has this mysterious past where we don't know a lot about his background, and that may be by design. It's possible that he doesn't want Mandy or her family or anybody to know a lot about him. It's interesting because we have someone who, on one hand, has estranged or distant relationships from family members, but on the other hand, has an identified loved one that they've idolized. It sets itself up for problems in the future.
Paul and Mandy lived in Oil Springs, Sayersville, Kentucky. Just a little town, a back road. Paul, he worked at a nursing home, and he brought home the money.
He paid for the home that they lived in.
She didn't have to work at all, Mandy didn't. He'd made sure she had everything she needed, didn't let her go without. At first, Paul seemed like a good man, from what I seen anyway.
But sometimes Paul would say a lot of negative things on Facebook. That may have been his way to get his point across, was through social media. Say the things on there that he couldn't say in person.
It's a Facebook post from Paul. All my life I've been called no good, that I'm worthless, that I will never amount to anything. I finally had enough and I came here to Kentucky, where I've got myself a home that I paid for. I have a beautiful, loving wife, and anyone says otherwise, they are a liar.
He was very fragile. I could see that. He never opened up, wouldn't talk. Maybe there was a reason behind it. There was a madness in his old life that I didn't know about.
Paula May's Facebook posts say to me that this is someone who's vulnerable and identifies with this role of someone who's been victimized and has to take on the world.
At the time, me and my husband had separated. My children were tiny. Mandy, she's like, if you want to, you can come here, you can stay with me and Paul. She's like, we can spend time together, get back to being sisters. And so in my mind, it was an awesome idea because I loved Mandy. She was my best friend.
Mandy, she loved her hair dye. She started dyeing her hair crazy colors. It was blue, purple, and one time she messed it up and it was half blonde, half blue.
One time we were gonna dye both of our hair that same night. And we was gonna go out and get the hair dyed. And Paul wouldn't allow us to do it. Paul, it wasn't a necessary thing, so she wasn't allowed to do it.
Why was that?
I don't know why he wouldn't allow her to do it. I'm trying to answer these for you, but I can't find a rhyme to the reason of why he wouldn't let her. I suppose he treated her like a child.
The fact that Paul LeMay's relationship with Mandy appears to be more like that of a father and a daughter is indicative of his controlling nature. It's also interesting that in this day and age, where social media and videos of one another are very common, that there's actually very little of that with Paul LeMay and Mandy. If he can control the little day-to-day tasks that she does, he can ultimately control her life.
Paul would work and he would come home and I would say, hi, Paul. He would say hello, and that was it. He would always lock himself in his bedroom.
The folks who are quiet and brooding and kind of seething underneath, those are the folks that you may least expect, but who could prove to be the most dangerous.
He would always lock himself in his bedroom. I thought it was weird. He wouldn't associate with the rest of us. Nobody really knew what was going on in there. Paul could be quiet, Paul could be shy. Behind closed doors, Paul could be a creep. He would lock himself in there like a hermit crab. One time she had opened the door and asked him what he wanted for supper, and he told her, I don't care what we have for supper, I don't care if we effing eat or not. In my mind, she was trying to take care of him and do what a wife should be doing for a husband. And he was straight up disrespectful to her.
This is Mandy at a rough time. About 25, probably. This looks like the time she had gotten arguments with Paul.
A lot of the times they would argue. They would argue in the bedroom, in their room. And we tried to stay away from that because I had kids and I didn't want them to hear that. So we always tried to stay out of the arguments. It was always behind that bedroom door. Mandy would go in her room, she would come back out and she'd be like, oh, it's happened again. Paul, he's in one of his moods.
But she chose to stay.
I don't know why she chose to stay, but I think a lot of it is that she was actually building a home and building a life. And it's just like, to her, it was nothing. Like she'd grown used to it.
There's indication that the arguments between Paul and Mandy are escalating. It begs the question of, what's happening there. Is it that he feels he's losing control and his own insecurity is knocking at the door? When someone like Paul doesn't feel in control, he may lash out impulsively.
One day we was going up to see Mom, and we had made it from Sayersville to Prestonsburg, and we made it that far before he had called her on his break, and there was a heated argument to the point that she pulled over and we turned around and went back. Anytime Mandy had to do anything, she had to run it by Paul and make sure Paul was okay with it. He had come home from work and he said he wasn't feeling good, so he went in there and he laid down and went to sleep. And so me and Mandy and the kids had went out to Walmart. And he was so mad when we come back because she had left without saying something to him that she actually went into the room and wasn't allowed back. She didn't come back out that night.
Here's a situation where Paul is about 20 years older than Mandy, yet he has effectively grounded her. When individuals are that controlling and domineering, it makes you wonder what else is happening behind closed doors.
Felt like she was trapped in a prison. Mandy would say things like, I feel like I'm in jail sometimes, Paul was very controlling. The last 2 or 3 months that I stayed there, we didn't really go anywhere or do anything. Pretty much the only thing he allowed Mandy to do was to do the grocery shopping.
He wouldn't let her go anywhere and do anything or see anyone. But when she stopped coming around, I knew something was up.
Several times I told Mandy that she didn't have to put up with that. She could leave, but she never would listen. It's like it was her relationship. I needed to butt out of it. It wasn't any of my business. Me and the kids would stay in that room on the opposite side from where her and Paul would stay. We just kept them back there unless they needed to come out and use the bathroom. It was like we were walking on eggshells, so to speak, tiptoeing around the house. I wish I would have stepped in and done something because I feel like I could have helped her out. And I wish I'd just let her know that I cared more. You know what I mean? I wish I got her out of there.
Paul is this quiet fella who keeps to himself. But as time goes on, His Facebook posts start to get more aggressive.
Last night was a tough night. I cried most of the night. The enemy wanting me to do something, but I was strong enough not to do it. Hopefully today is a better day. Now I kind of beat myself up for not putting them on my Facebook. I've never seen these.
It just hurts me. I've not seen those.
From a religious perspective, Paul may be referring to the enemy as Satan. It's also possible that the enemy is his rage, his insecurity. This is an example of an individual who seems to be fighting to control their behavior.
This Facebook post is Paul is really trying to bury those demons and keep himself from crossing that line from verbal aggression to physical aggression.
Had I seen this at the time, I'd been angry. I'd tried to help her.
It begs the question, what kind of threats could Paul LeMay have been making behind closed doors? Regardless of which way we go, we're heading into the abyss. Things are about to get worse.
One day, one of the kids had climbed up on the table and had knocked over a couple of plates and cups that was sitting on the table from when they were eating. Paul, he didn't really explode or anything. He went into the room, he had hollered for Mandy to come in there, and I don't know what was happening to Mandy. Like I said, she was in that room, they were locked in there, I don't know. They were in there for over an hour, and when they came out, they had got a change or two of clothes for each one of them. And she told me that they'd be back. That's when Paul and Mandy had left there. I could tell something was wrong. Not often my sister calls me crying. She told me she was scared for him to be around the kids. If I didn't get the kids out of there before they got back, that something was going to happen. He might hurt them or something.
There's increasing evidence that Paul LeMay is becoming unraveled. That's particularly worrisome because individuals who threaten or hurt children tend to lack remorse and empathy for others.
It did kind of scare me at that point. So the best thing for me to do for my kids was to leave. When I left there with the kids, things with Paul and Mandy got a lot worse.
The trouble was, Paul would act normal sometimes. Sometimes he didn't seem like a bad guy at all. He was nice, he was polite. To me, it was strange.
We're seeing this Jekyll and Hyde personality. We have someone who's on one hand saying, Mandy, I love you, my beautiful wife. And on the other hand, someone who is controlling her, potentially threatening children, not giving her money to go to the store. So we see these two diametrically opposed personality behaviors, and that's actually quite common in individuals who perpetrate interpersonal violence.
There was a couple months after I moved out, she was telling me that he was getting a lot more aggressive. She was telling me that Paul was starting to be more physical with her. Started out with him shoving her, and then it got worse. He would get in her face and he would get more violent with her. She said she was scared that if she didn't get out of there, that she wouldn't get out of there. she called me and told me she did leave Paul. She was at a friend's house, that she was scared of him and that she didn't want to go back home. She told me they were good people, she was safe. I didn't really question it. She was out of the bad situation, so in my mind, she was good. And she told me she was going to come over for Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving is really important to our family because it's the only time we actually sit down around the table and gather around and pray over the food.
I was excited. I'm not gonna lie, it's been months since I got to see my sister, so I was excited.
The family are ready to eat Thanksgiving dinner. Dinner comes and goes, but there's no Mandy.
Nobody could get a hold of her. Nobody knew exactly where she was. I was the last one to know where she was, and she was supposed to be at that friend's house.
As the minutes turned to hours, the hours turned to days, I could imagine a whole host of thoughts, running through their head about where Mandy might be. Maybe she's in the hospital. Maybe she's just out having a good time. Maybe Mandy's gone to see somebody else for Thanksgiving, and maybe she'll turn back up.
Couldn't believe what happened next. Mandy had told me she was at a friend's house and she was safe. But then we wasn't having no luck getting hold of her. I tried contacting her phone, her Facebook, her messenger, and she just would not answer. I didn't even know where to start to go to look. I had went out and I had printed off some photos to give the state police.
The uncertainty of it all was a very terrifying moment for that family, just not knowing. Despite the family's concern over Mandy being gone for 2 to 3 weeks, on December 17, there's a post on her Facebook account.
I needed to get away from the drama and dry myself out. I will contact the ones in my family after the first of the year.
I knew reading that day that wasn't Mandy.
I love you. Please understand I'm going through hard times right now, but I will contact you after the first. Love you later.
That's words of an alcoholic. Mandy wasn't an alcoholic and didn't have to dry herself out. Everything in this is spelled exactly as it should be, down to every last apostrophe and everything, and Mandy always spelled things very weird. Her spelling was never correct, and everything in this was right. And so, reading this when it came out, everybody knew something was wrong. Everybody knew that wasn't Mandy.
Homer then contacted Paul asking where Mandy was, what was going on. Homer asked them if it was them that posted that on there. Paul wouldn't speak back. Dad was trying to find his sister. After a while, Paul says, I ain't heard from her in weeks either. That's when Dad got mad and called the cops.
Inspector Thompson.
Yes, now I was wondering, how do I go about filing a missing person report?
Okay, what's going on?
Okay, my sister, her and her husband had split up, and nobody has seen her since the day before Thanksgiving.
Who is your sister?
Mandy and King LeMay.
Okay, and what's your name?
Homer King.
Okay, and she's married?
Yes. He's telling us that he hasn't seen her since the day before Thanksgiving either.
Okay, I'll have a trooper make contact with you, okay?
Okay, I appreciate it.
Homer was really annoyed at Paul. He was wanting to know where Mandy was, but she ain't spoke to nobody in over 3 weeks.
We know from the evidence so far that Mandy has been controlled by Paul. And the family's probably thinking maybe it's just their relationship. It's very possible that Paul has Mandy trapped inside the house.
When the trooper arrives to Mandy and Paul's residence, he goes up onto the porch. The blinds are drawn, he can't see inside the residence. He hears a series of what he describes as thumps. It sounded like someone was moving around in the home, but nobody ever came to the door. So that trooper immediately radios for backup. Paul is in fact inside the residence and is not coming out of the residence. The Kentucky State Police show up very quickly. It has escalated into a barricaded subject who's refusing to come out and respond to law enforcement commands and who is known to own a .22 caliber handgun. They were concerned that Mandy was being held inside the residence. As the Kentucky State Police are trying to get Paul LeMay to cooperate with their commands, they're looking for folks, neighbors, who might have any means to contact Paul. One of the neighbors happens to have Paul LeMay on Facebook Messenger. And Paul responds. Paul's still refusing to come out of the residence. But as the time goes on, Paul wants a cigarette. The Kentucky State Police tell Paul, "You've got to come to us." Paul is very reluctant to do this. So the neighbor, Pat, volunteers to take the cigarette to Paul, who's standing on the porch. Now, at this time, when Paul comes out of the residence, Paul LeMay is dressed in nothing but sweatpants and no shirt. It's December 17 in Kentucky. It's very cold, so the next door neighbor, Pat, also offers his sweatshirt. As soon as Paul LeMay gets that sweatshirt, he is rushed by 2 troopers who are laying in wait, and that's how the Kentucky State Police eventually got Paul into custody. The state police begin a sweep of the LeMay residence to look for Mandy. At that point, they had no idea whether she was dead or alive. When the troopers walked into the LeMay residence, they were met by the smell of death. They could smell decomposition in the air. When they get into this back bedroom, they can make out a pile of blankets, and sticking out from the bottom of that blanket is what is obviously a human foot. They pull the sheets back, and there they find the deceased body of Mandy LeMay. She had a single gunshot wound to the back of her head. What's clear, at this point, she had been there for quite some time.
I got a call from Daddy. He said, she's gone. She won't be coming back. I fell to the floor. My whole body was paralyzed for 3 days after that.
I never knew she went back there to even think that could have happened. I'm done. That's as far as I want to go.
A family in Johnson County is wishing they would have seen the signs after police say their family member, Mandy LeMay, was shot and killed by her husband.
Paul LeMay's statements to Kentucky State Police during his recorded interview tells us that Paul was obviously in a very troubled place.
I just want you to tell me what happened.
You know what happened. You want me to come out and say it? I'll say it. Yes, I killed her. I didn't want to. I loved the woman, damn it.
My guess is that Paul did it so that nobody else could have her, and she couldn't leave him.
It's gonna come out that I'm the bad guy no matter what. They're gonna take her side over me.
Paul clearly identifies as the victim. Individuals who fail to take responsibility for their own actions are some of the same individuals who are callous and lack empathy and remorse.
She would have been alive now if she wouldn't have went back. But Mandy couldn't make up her mind whether she loved him or not.
I'm gonna be betrayed as a monster.
You want to tell me how you done it?
We learned through the course of the investigation, Mandy had left the marital residence and hadn't returned for quite some time. But eventually, Mandy LeMay returns home.
I just sat on the couch looking at her.
She tells Paul that she's lost her telephone. She doesn't have one, and she needs a mean of communications. She wants to be able to reach out to her family and set up this plan to go spend Thanksgiving with her family, to have dinner with him.
She wanted to use a phone. She was talking to someone.
We know that Paul LeMay is in the house at that time, and he is likely hearing these conversations take place. He understands that in a few more days, when Thanksgiving rolls around, Mandy's going to be back out the door again, spending time with her family, and eventually an argument between the two ensues.
At this point, Paul knows that he's lost Mandy. He's lost control of the one person in his life, the source of his ego. And now we can see that the dark impulses are going to seep back in. It's almost like a volcano erupting. This is the last straw.
What little bit of heart I had left for her, it just went away.
The evidence in this case shows that Paul LeMay went to his bedroom.
What kind of gun was it, Paul?
A .22 revolver.
He took that revolver into the living room, he put that gun to the back of Mandy LeMay's head, and he pulled that trigger.
Well, from what I was told, he shot her in the back bedroom and dragged her to their bed, and he slept next to her those several weeks that she was laying there.
In the very end, after she died, Paul still didn't want to let her go. This is indicative of yet another final opportunity for him to control her.
I reckon Paul was trying to preserve the body because he literally slept in a freezing house next to her. So y'all had the funeral. It's hard for me to walk through the funeral doors. I walked out when I seen the casket and it was closed. I didn't even get to tell her goodbye.
I could have got Mandy out. Mandy could have been safe. Mandy could be here with us now.
It would have been nice if Mandy could have met my children more. I could explain to them better of how good of a person she was, how good of an aunt she would have been, how much they would have been spoiled. It hurts me every day that she can't be here with us today.
Paul was evaluated by 2 psychiatrists, both of whom cleared him as competent to stand trial.
You swear the testimony about to give is the truth, whole truth, and nothing but truth, self you got.
Yeah, I do.
Your name?
Paul LeMay.
Grand jury charges on or about November 20, 2018. You committed the death of Mandy LeMay by shooting her in the head, which caused her death, that being the charge of murder. You wish to enter into a guilty plea based on the Commonwealth's offer on plea of guilt?
Yes.
If I accept your plea,
Paul LeMay didn't actually go to trial. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of murder, 1 count of abuse of a corpse.
Judge, on behalf of Mr. LeMay, he declines to make a statement other than to say that the truth that he would tell wouldn't be believed by anyone.
It's still very frustrating that he couldn't explain to everybody in court why he did do it.
And that's all he wanted me to say on his behalf.
And so he thought he didn't have to give his explanation. He didn't have to tell her why.
what's that? Okay. All right. So take him on back.
That's what makes me lose sleep at night. Because I'll never know why. I'll never know why it happened. I'll never know.
There's likely several reasons why Paul ended up murdering Mandy. Paul wanted control from the very beginning, and he had it until the very end.
She was an amazing person.
Mandy would want to be remembered as the funny, goofy, outgoing, people-friendly person that she was. I like to think I'm going to see her again. That's what keeps me going every day. We'll see our loved ones again.
The fog didn't just roll into Oak Haven that night. It descended like a heavy, suffocating curtain, blotting out the stars above the California coastline, swallowing the streetlights until they were nothing more than dying embers in a world gone gray. November 14th, 1998. A date that would become a scar on the timeline of this quiet, affluent community. A wound that refused to close for nearly 3 decades. At 11:42 p.m., The silence of the Pacific Coast Highway was shattered not by the crash of waves, but by a sound far more primal, far more terrifying, a single, piercing scream that seemed to tear the very fabric of the night apart. It was the sound of a life shattering, the prelude to a mystery that would haunt every hallway, every living room, and every police station in the state. This wasn't just a crime. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would sleep in the beds of Oak Haven's residents, a cold case in the making before the body was even cold. To understand the horror, you have to understand the silence. Oak Haven was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, where the police blotter was filled with noise complaints and lost dogs. It was a sanctuary of wealth and safety, perched on the cliffs overlooking the churning ocean. But that illusion of safety evaporated the moment a passing motorist saw something pale and motionless near the guardrail at mile marker 42. He thought it was a mannequin, a discarded prop from a high school play. He slowed down, his headlights cutting through the thick mist, painting long, grotesque shadows against the wet asphalt. He pulled over, the gravel crunching beneath his tires sounding like gunshots in the quiet night. He stepped out, his breath pluming in the chill air, heart hammering a warning rhythm against his ribs. As he walked closer, the wind shifted, carrying the metallic, coppery scent that every predator knows and every prey animal fears. It wasn't a mannequin. It was 17-year-old Jessica Thorne. Jessica was the golden girl of Oak Haven. Homecoming queen, varsity swimmer, the kind of girl whose smile seemed to promise that the world was a good, kind place. Now, she lay discarded like refuse on the side of the road, her blue silk dress, the one she had worn to the autumn formal just hours earlier, torn and stained with the mud of the embankment. But it was the positioning of the body that would later make seasoned detectives vomit at the scene. She wasn't just killed, she was posed. Her hands were folded peacefully over her chest, her hair fanned out in a perfect halo around her head, as if she were sleeping on a bed of damp leaves and cold asphalt. It was a tableau of death, meticulously arranged by a mind that didn't just want to kill, but wanted to send a message. A message of control, a message of ownership. The motorist scrambled back to his car, fumbling for his brick-sized cell phone, his fingers shaking so violently he dropped it twice before dialing 911. The operator who took the call later said she had never heard a grown man sound so small, so utterly broken by what he was seeing. "Send everyone," he had whispered. "Just send everyone." Within 12 minutes, the peaceful fog was ripped apart by a cacophony of sirens. Red and blue lights strobed against the mist, creating a disorienting, hallucinogenic light show that danced over the crime scene. The first unit to arrive was a rookie patrolman, barely older than Jessica herself. He stepped out of his cruiser, flashlight beam cutting a trembling path through the dark, and froze. The scene was too quiet, too clean. There was no blood on the pavement, no tire tracks, no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had simply floated down from the sky and landed there. This was the first anomaly, the first loose thread in a tapestry of lies that would take 26 years to unravel. The sheer impossibility of the scene struck everyone who arrived. How could a violent murder leave no trace? How could a girl fight for her life and leave no mark on the world around her? Then the command car arrived. A sleek, black Crown Victoria that commanded respect just by its presence. Out stepped the man who was the bedrock of Oak Haven, the symbol of law and order, Police Chief Marcus Sterling. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair that caught the flashing lights like a halo, Sterling was the man you called when the world made no sense. He was a decorated veteran, a father figure to the town, a man whose integrity was as solid as the granite cliffs below. He moved with a grim purpose, pushing past the yellow tape that was already being strung up like a barrier against reality. He approached the body, his face a mask of stone, betraying nothing. He knelt beside Jessica, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. The rookie officer watched him, waiting for orders, waiting for the chief to make sense of the senseless. Sterling reached out, a gloved hand hovering over the girl's face, a gesture that looked almost tender, almost possessive. He stood up slowly, turning to face his men, his voice low and gravelly, cutting through the wind. "Lock it down," Sterling commanded, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the lights. "Nobody in, nobody out. We find who did this. Tonight." But they didn't find him that night, nor the next. The investigation that followed was a frenzy of activity that masked a profound emptiness. The California 1998 cold case had officially begun, though no one dared call it that yet. The town of Oakhaven woke up the next morning to a reality that felt like a fracture in time. The news spread through telephone wires and over breakfast tables, a contagion of panic. Jessica Thorne found dead. Murder on the highway. Killer on the loose. The headlines screamed from the newsstands, black ink on cheap paper that couldn't capture the red horror of the night. Parents kept their children home from school. Gun sales in the county spiked by 300% in 48 hours. The community, once open and trusting, turned inward, eyes narrowing with suspicion. Every stranger was a potential monster. Every shadow held a knife. Chief Sterling was everywhere. He was on the evening news, his jaw set in grim determination, promising justice to Jessica's weeping parents. He was at the town hall meetings, calming the terrified masses with his authoritative baritone. He was the anchor in the storm, the one thing the town could cling to. "We are following every lead," he told the cameras, his eyes looking straight into the lens, straight into the living rooms of the voters who adore him. "We will turn over every stone. Evil has come to Oakhaven, and I will personally drive it out." The people cheered. They wept. They trusted him. Why wouldn't they? He was the hero of the story. No one noticed that the investigation seemed to be running in circles. No one noticed that key pieces of evidence were being mishandled, or that witness statements were being filed away in the wrong boxes. The chaos of the murder masked the incompetence, or the malice, of the process. The autopsy revealed details that only deepened the mystery. Jessica had been strangled, but not with hands. A ligature, something soft, something that left no abrasions, only a deep, purple bruise that encircled her neck like a choker. There was no sexual assault, no robbery. Her diamond earrings were still in her ears. Her purse was found miles away, untouched, cash and ID inside. It was a killing for the sake of killing, a display of power. The coroner, a man who had seen everything in his 30 years on the job, shook his head as he signed the report. "It's personal," he told Sterling in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway of the morgue. "Whoever did this knew her, or wanted to know her. This wasn't a random act of violence, Chief. This was an act of intimacy." Sterling had nodded, taking the report, his grip tightening on the manila folder until his knuckles turned white. "I'll handle it," he said. And he did. He handled it by steering the investigation toward a local drifter, a man named Elias Thorne, no relation to the victim, who lived in a shack down by the marina. Elias was an easy target. He was mentally ill, known for shouting at seagulls and wandering the streets at night. He had no alibi. He had no money for a lawyer. The narrative was perfect. The town needed a monster, and Sterling gave them one. The police raided Elias's shack, turning it upside down, finding nothing but trash and old newspapers. But under intense interrogation led by Chief Sterling himself behind closed doors, Elias became confused, agitated. He mumbled things that the police interpreted as a confession. The headlines changed. Drifter arrested. Oakhaven safe again. But the DNA didn't match. It was 1998 and forensic science was advancing, but it wasn't magic. They had a small sample of skin cells found under Jessica's fingernails, a microscopic fighting chance she had clawed back from her attacker in her final moments. It wasn't enough for a full profile back then, not with the technology they had, but it was enough to rule Elias out. The district attorney, a shark of a woman named Elena Vance, refused to press charges. "I can't convict a man on a hunch, Marcus," she told the chief. "The science says no." Sterling was furious. Witnesses described him sweeping papers off his desk, his face flushed with a rage that seemed disproportionate. "The science is wrong," he had bellowed. I looked in his eyes. "I know it's him. But the law was the law. Elias was released, fading back into the shadows, a broken man who would die of exposure 2 years later, forever branded as the suspected killer in the eyes of the town. And so, the trail went cold. The California 1998 cold case began to gather dust. The yellow tape came down. The flowers left at mile marker 42 wilted and rotted, turning into brown mulch. The seasons changed. The fog rolled in and out, indifferent to the suffering of the Thorne family. Jessica's room remained a shrine, preserved exactly as she had left it, the scent of her perfume lingering like a ghost. Her parents, hollowed out by grief, divorced a year later. The father moved away, unable to look at the ocean without seeing his daughter's body. The mother stayed, becoming a specter in her own home, haunting the police station, demanding answers that Chief Sterling could not, or would not, give. The years began to stack up like bricks in a wall of silence. 1999, 2000. 2005, the case was passed from detective to detective, each one hitting the same brick wall. It's a perfect crime, one investigator noted in the file in 2008. No witnesses. No weapon. No motive. It's like a ghost did it. But ghosts don't leave DNA. That tiny sample, that microscopic speck of genetic truth, sat in a refrigerated evidence locker, waiting. It was a time bomb ticking in the heart of the police department, waiting for the future to arrive, waiting for technology to catch up to the lies. Meanwhile, Chief Sterling's career soared. He was credited with keeping the crime rate low. Ironic, considering the town's most famous murder remained unsolved. He ran for mayor. He won. He became the face of the city, a man untouchable, revered. He attended the memorial services for Jessica every year, bowing his head in solemn prayer, shaking the hands of the mother whose life had been destroyed. He looked into the cameras and spoke of vigilance and hope. He built a legacy on a foundation of silence. But the community never truly recovered. The innocence was gone. The shock of that night in November 1998 had seeped into the groundwater. Oak Haven was a town holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the monster to return. Little did they know, the monster hadn't gone anywhere. He was sitting at the head of the table. He was pinning medals on officers. He was signing the budget for the new forensic lab. The irony was Shakespearean in its tragedy. The very man charged with hunting the killer was the one ensuring the hunter never found the prey. The file on Jessica Thorne grew thicker with useless tips and psychic's visions, burying the few real clues under a mountain of noise. The deadlock was absolute. It felt as if the universe itself was conspiring to keep the truth hidden in the fog. But time is the enemy of all lies. As the calendar turned, a new generation of detectives joined the force. Young, hungry, raised on CSI and new forensic methodologies. They looked at the dusty boxes in the cold case archive not as burdens, but as challenges. In 2024, a cold case unit was formed, funded by a state grant. Their mandate: review unsolved homicides with modern technology. At the top of the pile, the case that had defined the town for a quarter of a century, the murder of Jessica Thorne. The detective in charge was a woman named Sarah Jenkins, sharp, relentless, and unburdened by the politics of the past. She didn't care about reputations. She didn't care about statues or mayors. She cared about the science. And when she pulled that tiny, degraded DNA sample from the evidence locker, she didn't just see a biological marker. She saw the key to Pandora's box. She ordered a new kind of test: genetic genealogy. The same technology that caught the Golden State Killer. It wasn't about matching a suspect in the database. It was about building a family tree from the killer's blood. It was a long shot. The sample was old, degraded by time and poor storage. But it was the only shot they had. As the sample was sent off to a private lab in Virginia, the town of Oak Haven went about its business, unaware that the fuse had finally been lit. Mayor Sterling, now in his late 60s but still powerful, still imposing, gave a speech at the Rotary Club about the importance of legacy. He had no idea that his legacy was currently spinning in a centrifuge 3,000 miles away, separating truth from fiction, preparing to scream the name he had hidden for 26 years. The file box for case number November 14th, 98 sat on the metal desk of Detective Sarah Jenkins like a physical weight, a tombstone made of paper and regret. In the basement of the Oak Haven precinct, the air was always stale, recycled through vents that hadn't been cleaned since the 90s, smelling faintly of old coffee and ozone. This was the cold case unit, the place where dead ends came to die, the purgatory for justice. But Sarah didn't believe in purgatory. She believed in data. She believed in the chaotic, spiraling ladder of DNA that defined every human being on Earth. The sample sent to Virginia, a microscopic speck of skin cells scraped from beneath the fingernails of a 17-year-old girl dead for 26 years, was no longer just evidence. It was a time machine. 3,000 miles away, in a sterilized lab that hummed with the sound of sequencers and servers, the ghost of Jessica Thorne was speaking. The process wasn't instantaneous like in the movies. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through the labyrinth of genetic history. The technicians weren't looking for a direct hit in the Cody's database that had been tried a dozen times over the years, always returning the same mocking result: no match. The killer had never been arrested for felony, never had his cheek swabbed, never entered the system. He was a ghost. But ghosts have families. Ghosts have second cousins who take ancestry tests to find out if they're Irish or Italian. Ghosts have distant aunts who upload their genetic data to public websites hoping to build a family tree. And that is where the trap was laid. The technique is called forensic genetic genealogy. It is the most powerful weapon in modern law enforcement, and for a killer who thinks he got away with it, it is the invisible noose tightening around a neck that has felt safe for decades. The lab took Jessica's killer's DNA and turned it into a digital file, a string of millions of code points. Then, they uploaded it to the open-source databases, the digital town squares where millions of people share their biology. They weren't looking for the killer. They were looking for anyone who shared a significant amount of DNA with him. They were looking for the branches to find the trunk. Weeks passed. In Oak Haven, the fog continued its nightly invasion, dampening the sound of the traffic on the highway, slicking the cobblestones of the town square where a bronze statue of Mayor Marcus Sterling was being commissioned. The town went about its business, buying groceries, walking dogs, oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath their feet was about to liquefy. Sarah checked her email every morning with a ritualistic dread. Nothing, 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 until a Tuesday morning in March. A ping. A subject line that simply read, Oak Haven John Doe, potential leads. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She opened the attachment. It wasn't a name. It was a web. A complex, sprawling diagram of names and dates, connected by thin black lines. The genealogist in Virginia had found a match. Not the killer, but a third cousin. A woman living in Ohio who had never been to California. But from that one woman, the genealogist had worked backward, climbing up the family tree to great-grandparents in the 1920s, then climbing back down different branches, tracing the lineages, the marriages, the births. It was a process of elimination, a mathematical deduction of existence. They were looking for a male. Someone who was in Oak Haven in 1998. Someone who would have been in the right age range. The list of potential suspects had been narrowed down from millions to 5. 5 men in the entire country who fit the genetic profile and the family tree. Sarah scanned the names. 2 were already dead. 1 was in a nursing home in Florida, bedridden since 1995. 1 lived in Oregon and had documented proof of being overseas in the military during the time of the murder. That left 1 branch. 1 lineage that led straight back to the California coast. The cursor on Sarah's screen hovered over the final cluster of names. The bloodline was prominent, distinguished, a family that had roots in the area going back to the gold rush. She read the surname, Sterling. The air in the basement seemed to vanish. Sarah sat back in her chair, the cheap springs creaking loudly in the sudden silence. She blinked, sure that her eyes were betraying her, sure that the screen was glitching. Sterling. It was the most common name in Oak Haven. There were Sterling Streets, the Sterling Library, the Sterling Pier. It had to be a coincidence. It had to be a distant relation, some black sheep of the family who had drifted into town and killed Jessica. It couldn't be the Sterlings. Not the family of the man who is currently sitting in the mayor's office, the man who had been the chief of police the night Jessica died. The man who was her boss's boss's boss. But the genealogy report was ruthless in its precision. It didn't care about politics. It didn't care about reputations. It pointed to a specific family unit. The DNA came from a male descendant of Thomas and Martha Sterling. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the local archives, her fingers flying across the keyboard, cross-referencing the family tree with local records. She needed to know who in that family was in Oak Haven in 1998. The results came up instantly. The family was small. Thomas and Martha had 2 sons. One died in Vietnam. The other was Marcus Sterling. Marcus had no brothers. He had no sons. He was the only male in that direct genetic line who was alive and present in Oak Haven on November 14, 1998. Nausea rolled over her. This wasn't just a lead. It was a catastrophe. If she was wrong, even whispering this would end her career. She would be laughed out of the precinct, sued, destroyed. But if she was right, then the man who had comforted Jessica's mother, the man who had vowed to hunt down the animal who did this, was the animal himself. The cognitive dissonance was blinding. Marcus Sterling was a hero. He had saved a busload of kids from a flood in '92. He had taken a bullet in a bank robbery shootout in '88. He was the definition of the good cop. How could he be the monster who left a teenage girl posed like a doll on the side of the highway? Sarah stood up, pacing the small confines of the cold case office. She needed to think. She couldn't tell anyone. Not her lieutenant, not her partner. In a town this small, loyalty was currency, and everyone was in debt to Marcus Sterling. If she leaked this, it would get back to him in an hour. And if he was the killer, what would he do? A man who could strangle a girl and then calmly run the investigation into her death was capable of anything. He was a sociopath of the highest order, functioning in plain sight, camouflaged by a badge. She had to be sure. The genealogy was a pointer, not proof. She needed a direct DNA match. She needed to get Marcus Sterling's DNA without him knowing. But how do you steal the genetic code of the most powerful man in the city? And before that, she needed to understand the impossible. How did he get away with it? He was the chief. He was at the scene. He ran the investigation. Suddenly, the files from 1998 looked very different. Sarah pulled the original case boxes off the shelves, the dust motes dancing in the fluorescent light. She opened the suspects binder. She opened the alibis folder. She was looking for Marcus Sterling's name. It wasn't there. Why would it be? He wasn't a suspect. He was the investigator. But there was a timeline of police movements that night. She found the dispatch log, a yellowed sheet of paper with typed entries. 2342, 911 call received. 2355, Unit 4 arrives at scene. 010, Chief Sterling arrives at scene. Where was he before 010? Sarah dug deeper, finding the shift roster. Chief Sterling was listed as off-duty that evening. But in his supplementary report, written by him, he stated he was at the precinct catching up on paperwork when the call came in. Sarah stared at the words. At the precinct. Alone. No witnesses. It was the perfect alibi, because nobody questions the boss. If the chief says he was in his office, he was in his office. Who is going to check the security cameras? Who is going to ask the desk sergeant? In 1998, there were no internal cameras in the administrative wing. He was a ghost in his own building. She looked at the crime scene photos again. The lack of struggle. The lack of evidence. The clean scene. It had baffled investigators for decades. But now, through the lens of this new horror, it made terrifying sense. Jessica knew him. He was the police chief. If he pulled her over, she wouldn't run. She would roll down her window. She would trust him. If he offered her a ride, she would get in. The lack of struggle wasn't because she was weak. It was because she was betrayed. The ambush didn't happen in the dark. It happened in the light of authority. And the clean scene? Who knows how to clean a crime scene better than the man who runs the forensics team? Who knows what to pick up, what to wipe down, what to remove? He didn't just hide the evidence. He likely controlled the collection of it. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement temperature. She realized she was looking at a masterpiece of deception. A 26-year performance art piece where the villain played the hero. She remembered the news footage from back then, Sterling's intense, grieving face. "We will find him." It wasn't a promise. It was a taunt. He was mocking them. He was mocking everyone. But there was a flaw. There is always a flaw. He couldn't have predicted 2024. He couldn't have predicted that the skin cells he didn't even know he left behind, cells too small to be seen by the naked eye, too complex for 1998 science to read, would one day scream his name. He had beaten the police, the courts, the public. But he couldn't beat the future. Sarah closed the file. Her hands were steady now. The shock had burned off, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She was a hunter now, and she had the scent. But this wasn't just a hunt. It was a war. A war against the most powerful man in Oakhaven. She grabbed her burner phone. She wouldn't use her department issue, not anymore, and dialed the number of the one person she could trust, an old retired FBI agent she knew from a seminar, a man who had no ties to Oakhaven, no loyalty to Sterling. "I need advice," she whispered when he answered, her voice echoing slightly in the empty basement. "Hypothetically, if I have a cold case, and the DNA points to the top of the food chain, the very top, how do I not get killed before I can prove it?" The silence on the other end was heavy. Then, the voice came back, grim and serious. "You don't go home, Sarah. You don't sleep. And you sure as hell don't trust anyone with a badge. You get that sample. And you pray you're wrong. Because if you're right, you're not just fighting a killer. You're fighting the system." She hung up. She looked at the photo of Jessica Thorne taped to the whiteboard. The girl's eyes seemed to bore into her, pleading, demanding. "He's right there," the eyes seemed to say. "He's been right there the whole time." Sarah grabbed her coat. She had to get close to him. She had to get into his orbit. Tonight was the annual Oakhaven Police Foundation Gala. Mayor Sterling would be there. He would be drinking. He would be eating. He would be leaving behind trash. Napkins. Forks. Glasses. It was a suicide mission of sorts, walking into the lion's den to steal a hair from his mane. But she had no choice. The Oakhaven 1998 cold case was no longer cold. It was burning hot, and Sarah was standing right in the center of the fire. She walked out of the basement, passing the rows of uniformed officers in the hallway, the men and women who worshipped Marcus Sterling. She wondered how many of them knew. She wondered if he had accomplices. Or if he was truly a lone wolf, fooling them all. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, the fog was rolling in again, just like it did in 1998. It felt different now. It didn't feel like a blanket. It felt like a shroud. And somewhere in that fog, the mayor was tying his tie, looking in the mirror, perhaps thinking he had won. He didn't hear the footsteps coming for him. Not yet. The Oakhaven Grand Hotel was a fortress of light against the encroaching coastal fog, its ballroom glowing like an ember in the dark, pulsating with the rhythm of a live jazz band and the murmurs of the city's elite. To anyone looking in from the outside, through the frosted glass of the towering French doors, it was a scene of celebration, a gathering of the pillars of society. To Detective Sarah Jenkins, standing at the edge of the velvet rope with a clutch purse that felt heavier than a service weapon, it was a Shark Tank. The annual Police Foundation Gala was the night when money met power, where the wealthy donors of Oakhaven rubbed shoulders with the brass who kept their streets safe. But tonight, the champagne tasted like battery acid, and the laughter sounded like the sharpening of knives. Sarah wasn't here to celebrate. She was here to hunt. And her prey was the man standing in the center of the room, bathing in the adoration of the crowd. Mayor Marcus Sterling. He looked exactly like the statues they built of him. Even at 68, he possessed a vitality that sucked the air out of the room. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit his broad, swimmer's shoulders perfectly, a glass of amber liquid held casually in one large hand, The same hand that Sarah now suspected had wrapped a ligature around Jessica Thorne's neck 26 years ago. Seeing him in the flesh, after staring at the genealogy report that condemned his bloodline, was a physical shock. It was like looking at an optical illusion. One moment you see the benevolent leader, the next you see the monster, and your brain struggles to reconcile the two. He was laughing, his head thrown back, his teeth white and perfect, charming a circle of wealthy widows who hung on his every word. He looked untouchable. He looked safe. And that was his greatest weapon. Who would believe that this man, this titan of industry and law, was a predator? Sarah forced herself to move. She had to blend in. She had to become part of the scenery, just another detective showing face at the department's biggest night. But every step felt like walking on a wire over a canyon. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drum solo of adrenaline that threatened to deafen her. She navigated the sea of black tuxedos and shimmering gowns, her eyes locked on Sterling, tracking his movements, tracking that glass. It was a crystal tumbler, heavy, etched with the Foundation's logo. He was nursing it, swirling the ice, his fingerprints pressing against the glass with every gesture. That glass was the Holy Grail. It held the saliva, the epithelial cells, the undeniable truth that would burn his empire to the ground. But getting it was impossible. He was surrounded by a phalanx of sycophants and security. And even if she could get close, how do you steal a mayor's drink in a room full of cops? She circled the perimeter, grabbing a glass of sparkling water she had no intention of drinking, using it as a prop to keep her hands from shaking. She watched him move. He was a tactile politician. He touched arms, he clapped backs, he shook hands with a firm, two-handed grip. He was spreading his DNA everywhere, a contagion of charm. Sarah watched him finish his drink. He turned to a passing waiter, placing the empty glass on the tray. Sarah flinched. The waiter disappeared into the kitchen. Opportunity lost. She cursed silently. She couldn't raid the kitchen. There would be thousands of glasses, all mixed together in the soapy water. The chain of custody would be broken before it even started. She needed a direct transfer. She needed to take it from his hand, or from the table immediately after he set it down. She had to get closer. She had to enter the circle. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sarah adjusted her dress, a simple black number that she hoped made her invisible, and stepped into the light. She approached the group surrounding the mayor. Sterling spotted her. For a split second, she thought she saw a flicker of something behind his eyes. Recognition? Suspicion? A predator sensing another predator? But it vanished instantly, replaced by the warm, practiced beam of the politician. Detective Jenkins, his voice boomed, cutting through the chatter. The relentless force behind our new cold case unit. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the future of the Oakhaven PD. The spotlight was sudden and blinding. All eyes turned to her. Sarah felt exposed, stripped naked by their curiosity. She forced a smile, a brittle mask that felt like it might crack. "Mr. Mayor," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her veins. "Just doing the job." Sterling stepped forward, closing the distance. He smelled of expensive scotch, cedarwood, and old money. It was a scent that commanded respect, a scent that masked the metallic tang of blood that Sarah imagined clinging to him. He loomed over her, fatherly and menacing all at once. "And a hard job it is," he said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial rumble. "Digging into the past. It's dirty work. Sometimes, detective, the past is best left buried. Don't you think? Some wounds don't need to be reopened." The words hung in the air, heavy with double meaning. Was he warning her? Did he know? Or was this just the standard platitude of a man who wanted his town to look perfect? Sarah looked him dead in the eye, searching for the killer inside. "The families don't think so, sir," she replied, her voice soft but carrying a steel edge. "And the truth doesn't rot. It just waits." Sterling's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold, flat, like a shark's eyes rolling back before a strike. For a moment, just a terrifying heartbeat, the mask slipped. Sarah saw the arrogance, the absolute certainty that he was above her, above the law, above the truth. Then he laughed, a short, barking sound that broke the tension. Ideally put. Ideally put. The truth waits. I like that. I must use that in my next campaign speech. He turned back to the waiter. Another scotch. Neat. He turned his back on her, dismissing her, reducing her to a soundbite. He didn't fear her. He didn't even consider her a threat. That was his mistake. That arrogance was the crack in the armor. Sarah didn't retreat. She stayed on the periphery, watching as the fresh drink arrived. She watched him take a sip, leaving a perfect, ghostly lip print on the rim. She watched him hold it as he argued about zoning laws with a developer. She waited. 10 minutes. 20. Her legs ached from the tension. The gala was winding down. People were moving toward the exits or the coat check. This was the moment. If he finished the drink and left, the busboys would clear the table instantly. Sterling checked his watch. He drained the glass. He set it down on a high-top cocktail table near the edge of the dance floor, a table cluttered with empty napkins and abandoned hors d'oeuvre plates. "Gentlemen," he announced, "I have an early morning. The city doesn't sleep, so neither can I." He began to move toward the exit, his entourage flowing around him like a wake. The table was exposed, but a busboy was already moving toward it, a tray in hand, eyes locked on the dirty glassware. It was a race. Sarah didn't run. Running would draw attention, but she walked with a speed that bordered on panic. She had to beat the busboy. She had to get to that glass. She cut through the crowd, dodging a dancing couple, her eyes fixed on the target. The busboy was 10 feet away. Sarah was 15. She collided with a drunk donor, muttering a quick apology without looking back. 5 feet. The busboy reached for the table. Sarah lunged, not for the glass, but for the space between the busboy and the table. "Excuse me," she said, breathlessly, blocking his path. "Have you seen my phone? I think I left it here." The busboy paused, confused. No ma'am. I'm just clearing the..." "Please check under the table. It has a red case. It's urgent." She was improvising, her heart hammering so hard she thought he could hear it. The busboy bent down to look. In that split second of distraction, Sarah reached out. Her hand, gloved in a thin, sheer fabric she had slipped on in her pocket, closed around the base of Sterling's glass. It was still warm from his hand. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. She snatched it, dropping it straight into her open purse, the crystal clinking softly against her wallet. "No phone here, ma'am," the busboy said, standing up. "Oh, I must have left it at the bar. Sorry." "Thank you." She turned and walked away. She didn't look back at the empty spot on the table. She didn't look at the busboy's confused expression. She walked straight for the exit, her purse clutched to her side like a newborn baby. The glass inside felt radioactive. She expected alarms to blare. She expected Sterling's hand to clamp down on her shoulder. She expected the doors to lock. But nothing happened. The band played on. The laughter continued. The deception held. She pushed through the heavy doors into the cool night air, the fog swirling around her legs. She bypassed the valet stand, walking briskly to her own car parked in the shadows of the overflow lot. She didn't stop until she was inside, doors locked, engine off. Only then did she let herself breathe. She opened her purse. There it was. The Holy Grail. A dirty Scotch glass with the saliva of a monster on the rim. She pulled out a sterile evidence bag she had smuggled out of the lab, carefully maneuvering the glass inside, sealing it with a hiss of plastic. She marked it, Subject A, March 12th, 2024. No name. No case number. Just the date. This sample couldn't go to the department lab. Sterling's cronies ran that place. If she logged this into the system, it would be flagged. Why is Detective Jenkins running the mayor's DNA? The question alone would get her fired, or worse. She started the car, her hands gripping the wheel until her knuckles turned white. She had to drive to the private lab in the next county, a place she had paid for out of her own pocket, a place that asked no questions and sold only results. The drive was a blur of headlights and paranoia. Every car behind her looked like a tail. Every shadow looked like an assassin. She was carrying the end of an era in her passenger seat. She was carrying the vindication of Jessica Thorne. As she drove, the image of Sterling's smile replayed in her mind. The way he had said, "The truth waits." He was so sure of his control. He thought he was the author of the story. He thought he could edit out the bad parts, the parts where he strangled a 17-year-old girl and left her by the ocean. He didn't know that the story was being rewritten tonight. He didn't know that the ink was drying on his indictment. Sarah dropped the sample at the night drop box of the genetic lab, a nondescript industrial park building that looked nothing like the site of a revolution. She watched the metal drawer slide shut, swallowing the evidence. It was done. Now, the waiting game began again. But this time, the wait was different. It wasn't the hopeless wait of a cold case. It was the countdown of a bomb. She drove back to Oakhaven, the city lights twinkling on the horizon. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the dark, restless ocean. She drove past mile marker 42. She slowed down, looking at the spot where Jessica had been found. For 26 years, that spot had been a question mark. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like a period. A conclusion was coming. Sarah could feel it in her bones. The king was still on his throne, sleeping soundly in his mansion on the hill. But the foundation was cracked. The glass had been stolen. And the ghost of Jessica Thorne was no longer whispering. She was screaming. The weight was a physical thing, a living creature that sat on Sarah's chest for 3 days, counting every beat of her heart, mocking every breath she took. The private lab had promised a rush order, 48 hours, but 48 hours stretches into infinity when you are holding the potential end of a dynasty in your hands. Sarah went through the motions of her life, like an automaton. She sat at her desk in the basement, shuffling papers she wasn't reading, answering phones she wasn't listening to. She avoided the break room. She avoided eye contact with the uniformed officers who walked past, their boots thudding on the linoleum with a heavy, confident cadence of men who believe in their leader. Every time she saw a photo of Mayor Sterling on the precinct wall, that paternal smile, that reassuring gaze, she felt a wave of nausea so potent it made her dizzy. It was the sickness of knowing a truth that the rest of the world was too blind to see. It was the vertigo of standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you are about to jump and pull the whole mountain down with you. She slept with her phone under her pillow, jumping at every phantom vibration. She checked her secure email account every 10 minutes, refreshing the page until her thumb ached. And then, at 3:14 a.m. on a Friday morning, the silence broke. A single notification illuminated her dark bedroom, casting a ghostly blue light on her face. Subject: Analysis complete. Sample A. Sarah didn't open it immediately. She lay there in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the world. She knew that once she clicked that link, there was no going back. Once the file was open, ignorance was no longer an excuse. If the results were negative, if she had stolen the mayor's glass for nothing, she was just a paranoid detective who had committed theft and violated civil rights. She could delete the email, burn the evidence, and go back to being a loyal soldier. But if it was positive, if the numbers aligned, she became the enemy of the state. She took a breath that rattled in her lungs, sat up, and tapped the screen. The PDF loaded slowly, a spinning wheel of destiny. Then the numbers. The report was dense with scientific jargon, charts of alleles and loci, rows of data that looked like gibberish to the layman. But Sarah knew what to look for. She scrolled to the bottom, to the summary conclusion. The DNA profile obtained from the submitted item, whiskey glass, matches the DNA profile extracted from the ligature evidence in case November 14, 98 with a probability of 1 in 4.8 quintillion. The source of the sample cannot be excluded as the donor of the biological material found on the victim. Cannot be excluded. It's the scientific way of saying, it's him. 1 in 4.8 quintillion. There aren't even that many people on Earth. There aren't that many people who have ever lived. It was a mathematical certainty. The man who sat in the mayor's chair, the man who pinned medals on chests, the man who dedicated the Jessica Thorne Memorial Park, was the man who had tightened a cord around her neck until the light went out of her eyes. The realization hit Sarah not with a bang, but with a cold, creeping numbness. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She felt a profound, terrifying clarity. The world had tilted on its axis, and she was the only one standing upright. She got out of bed, her movements precise and mechanical. She printed the report on her personal printer, then deleted the email. She deleted the account. She scrubbed the browser history. She took the printed pages and placed them in a waterproof bag, then taped that bag to the underside of her floorboard in the closet. Paranoia? Maybe. But she was dealing with a man who had controlled a police department for 30 years. A man who knew how to make evidence disappear. A man who knew how to make people disappear. She couldn't leave this on a cloud server. She couldn't leave it on her phone. The next morning, the sun rose over Oakhaven as if nothing had changed. The birds sang. The garbage trucks rumbled. But for Sarah, the city was now a hostile territory. She drove to work, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror, checking for tails. She wasn't just a detective anymore. She was a spy in her own house. She needed a plan. She couldn't just walk into the chief's office and slap cuffs on the mayor. That was suicide. Sterling had judges in his pocket. He had the district attorney on speed dial. He had the press eating out of his hand. If she arrested him now, without an airtight strategy, he would claim the DNA was planted. He would claim contamination. He would destroy her credibility before the ink on the warrant was dry. He would make it about a rogue, mentally unstable detective with a vendetta. She needed backup. But who? The lieutenant was Sterling's godson. The captain was his old partner. The entire chain of command was poisoned by his influence. There was only one option. The Federal Bureau of Investigation. But not the local field office. They played golf with Sterling on Sundays. She needed someone from the outside. Someone who didn't care about Oakhaven politics. She needed Agent Miller. She drove past the precinct, continuing down the highway to a payphone at a gas station 3 towns over. It was archaic, something out of a noir film, but she couldn't risk the cell towers. She dialed the number she had memorized. Miller. The voice was gruff, tired. "It's Jenkins," Sarah said, her voice low, fighting the noise of the passing trucks. "I have the results. It's a match. A perfect match." There was a long silence on the other end. A silence that weighed the implications of arresting a sitting mayor. "You're sure?" Miller asked, the skepticism gone, replaced by a heavy seriousness. "You're absolutely sure, Sarah? Because once we pull this trigger, the gun doesn't unfire." 1 in 4.8 quintillion, she recited. "It's him, Miller. It's been him the whole time. He's walking around shaking hands with the same hands that... God, Miller, we have to move." "We can't just move," Miller snapped, his voice sharp. "We need a warrant. We need a grand jury. We need to blindside him. If he gets wind of this, he'll run. Or worse, he'll lawyer up and bury us in motions for 10 years. He's rich, Sarah. Rich men don't go to prison unless there's no other door open. So what do we do?" Sarah gripped the phone cord, her knuckles white. "I can't sit across from him. I can't look at him." "You have to," Miller commanded. "You have to act like everything is normal. You go to work. You work your cold cases. You smile. Meanwhile, I'm going to go to a federal judge in Sacramento. Someone Sterling doesn't know. Someone who hates corruption. I'll get a sealed indictment. But we need more than the DNA. DNA is strong, but juries are fickle with old evidence. They'll say it was transfer. They'll say it was mishandled. We need a trophy. A trophy. Serial killers keep trophies, Sarah. You know that. Especially the ones who stop. They need to relive the moment. He didn't kill again, did he? That means he's living off the memory. He has something of hers. Jewelry. A lock of hair. Photos. Something he can touch when the urge gets too strong. If we find that, he's dead. Game over. He's had 26 years to hide it, Sarah argued. He could have thrown it in the ocean. He didn't, Miller said with chilling confidence. Narcissists don't throw away their victories. It's in his house, or his safe deposit box, or his office. We need to search his sanctuary. Sarah felt a cold sweat prickle her skin. Searching the mayor's house. It was insane. It was impossible. How do we get probable cause to search the mayor's mansion based on a stolen glass and a 20-year-old crime scene sample? We don't, Miller said. We get him on something else. Tax fraud. Corruption. Anything to get us in the door. Then we find the box. I'll dig into his finances. You dig into his habits. Where does he go when he wants to be alone? Where is his private space? Find the lair, Sarah. The line went dead. Sarah hung up the receiver, feeling more alone than ever. Find the lair. She walked back to her car, her mind racing. Sterling was a public figure. His life was documented in newspapers and social pages. But everyone has a shadow side. Everyone has a room they don't let the maids clean. She drove back to Oakhaven, the mission shifting from biology to psychology. She had to profile the mayor. She had to get inside his head. She spent the next week in a fugue state of investigation. She pulled the blueprints of his estate from the city archives, claiming it was for a security assessment for an upcoming event. The house was a sprawling Victorian on the cliffs, 3 stories, a basement, a detached garage. But looking at the plans, something stood out. A renovation in 1999, 1 year after the murder. An extension to the study. A private library. It was soundproofed. It had a reinforced door. The permits were signed by Sterling himself, bypassing the usual inspections. The library. It made sense. Sterling was an intellectual, a man who prided himself on his knowledge. Of course, he would hide his secrets in a library. But how to get in? She couldn't break in. That would taint the evidence. She had to be invited. Or she had to create an emergency. The opportunity came in the form of a storm. A massive Pacific front was battering the coast, knocking out power lines, flooding streets. The police were on high alert. Emergency services were stretched thin. Mayor Sterling was coordinating the response from the Emergency Operations Center at City Hall. His house would be empty, but it would be guarded. Private security. Sarah sat in her car, watching the rain lash against the windshield, watching the news reports of the storm. She had a crazy idea. A dangerous, career-ending idea. If she could trigger a silent alarm at his house. A break-in signal. The police would have to respond. She could be the first responder. She could clear the house. She could get into that library. It was illegal. It was unethical. It was necessary. She drove to the cliffs, parking a mile away from the Sterling estate. She pulled on a black raincoat, grabbing a heavy flashlight. The wind was howling, a banshee scream that covered the sound of her approach. She moved through the trees, the rain soaking her to the bone, until the mansion loomed out of the darkness, a dark beast perched on the edge of the world. There were lights on the perimeter, but the house was dark. The security system was high-end, but Sarah knew the grid. She knew the blind spots. She had studied the schematics until they were burned into her retinas. She crept to the back of the property, to the French doors leading to the garden. She didn't break the glass. That was too amateur. She used a high-powered magnet to trip the reed switch on the door frame, tricking the system into thinking the door had been forced open. A second later, the silent alarm would be screaming at the monitoring station. The call would go to dispatch. 4:59 alarm, silent. Sterling residence. All units copy. Sarah was already sprinting back to her car. She threw herself into the driver's seat, gasping for breath, grabbing the radio. Dispatch. This is Detective Jenkins. I'm in the vicinity of the Sterling residence. I'll respond to that 4:59. Copy, Jenkins. Backup is 10 minutes out. Storm has the roads blocked. 10 minutes. She had 10 minutes alone in the monster's castle. She drove the car up the long driveway, lights flashing, siren off. She pulled up to the front door, gun drawn. She wasn't just playing a role. The adrenaline was real. She kicked the front door. It was locked. She circled back to the garden door, the one she had tripped. It was still closed, but now she had a reason to breach. Police. Is anyone inside? She shouted over the thunder. She used her baton to smash the pane near the lock, reached in, and turned the latch.
She was in.
The house smelled of lemon polish and silence. The air was cold. She moved quickly, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Foyer. Living room. Hallway. She ignored the expensive art, the silver. She headed straight for the east wing. The study. The library. The door was heavy oak, locked. But Sarah was prepared. She had the master skeleton keys from the precinct, keys that were supposed to be for welfare checks. She tried one. It stuck. She tried another. It turned. The door swung open with a groan that sounded like a coffin lid rising. She stepped inside. The room was lined floor to ceiling with books. Leather armchairs. A heavy mahogany desk. It looked like a gentleman's retreat. But Sarah wasn't looking for books. She was looking for the anomaly. She scanned the shelves. History. Law. Philosophy. Criminology. An entire section on famous murders. She ran her hand along the spines. Jack the Ripper. The Zodiac. The Black Dahlia. And there, tucked between two heavy volumes of case law, was a book that didn't fit. A photo album. Plain black leather. No title. Sarah's heart stopped. She pulled it down. It was heavy. She opened it. It wasn't photos. It was clippings. Newspaper clippings. Hundreds of them. All about Jessica Thorne. Every article ever written. Every headline. But pasted next to the articles were other things. Polaroids. Grainy, flashlit photos of a girl walking down the street. Photos taken from a car window. Photos of Jessica before she died. Stalking photos. And on the last page, taped to the cardboard, was a single silver earring. A diamond stud. The match to the one Jessica was wearing when she was found. The one the police report said was missing. Sarah stared at the earring, the light from her flashlight trembling. This was it. The trophy. The undeniable proof that Marcus Sterling didn't just investigate the murder. He lived it. He had hunted her. He had kept this shrine for 26 years, visiting it in the quiet of his library, reliving the power. Suddenly, the radio on her shoulder crackled. Jenkins, this is Unit 4. We're at the gate. Coming up the drive. Panic surged. She couldn't be found with this. She couldn't take it. If she took it without a warrant, it might be inadmissible. Fruit of the poisonous tree. She had to leave it. She had to leave the smoking gun right where it was. But now she knew where it was. Now she could tell Miller. Now they could get the warrant. She shoved the album back onto the shelf, ensuring it was perfectly aligned. She backed out of the room, locking the door. She ran to the kitchen, overturning a chair, making it look like a burglar had been disturbed and fled. By the time the headlights of the patrol cars swept across the front windows, Sarah was standing in the open front doorway, rain dripping from her hair, gun in hand, looking like a breathless hero. Clear, she shouted as the officers ran up the steps. Must have scared them off. They came in through the back. The officers nodded, deferential, unsuspecting. They didn't know that the real burglar was standing right in front of them. They didn't know that she had just stolen the mayor's secret. As she stood there, watching the blue lights bounce off the wet driveway, Sarah felt a grim satisfaction. The trap was set. The bait was identified. The lion's den had been breached. Now all that was left was to bring the cage. The sun rose on Tuesday, March 19th, with a deceptive brilliance, casting long, golden rays over the red-tiled roofs of City Hall, illuminating the bronze statue of Marcus Sterling that stood in the plaza like a guardian deity. To the citizens of Oakhaven, it was just another morning of commerce and coffee, the rhythmic pulse of a town at peace with itself. They had no idea that the peace was a lie, a thin veneer painted over a rotting foundation. They had no idea that 5 miles away, on the edge of the county line, a caravan of black SUVs was idling in formation, engines humming with a low, predatory growl. Inside those vehicles were 20 federal agents, clad in tactical gear, their faces grim, their orders absolute. Sitting in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle was Detective Sarah Jenkins, her badge hanging heavy around her neck, her hands resting on a thick dossier that contained the death warrant for a legacy. Beside her, Agent Miller checked his watch. "It's time," he said, his voice void of emotion. "Let's go catch a monster." The operation was split into two prongs, a synchronized strike designed to sever the head of the snake, while simultaneously seizing the venom. Team Alpha, led by Miller, would hit the mansion on the cliffs, executing the search warrant that Sarah's late-night reconnaissance had made possible. Their target was the library, the album, the earring. Team Bravo, led by Sarah herself, was headed for the heart of the beast, City Hall. The mayor was in a closed-door session with the city council, discussing the budget for the new police academy. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. He was planning the future of law enforcement while the past was racing up the highway to put him in chains. As the convoy rolled into town, the atmosphere shifted. The sight of federal plates and tinted windows sent a ripple of unease through the streets. People stopped on the sidewalks, shading their eyes, whispering. This wasn't the local raid. This was an invasion. The vehicles split at the main intersection. Miller's team peeled off toward the coast, tires screeching slightly as they accelerated. Sarah's team drove straight up the main boulevard, the sirens remaining silent, a terrifyingly quiet approach. They pulled up to the marble steps of City Hall, the doors of the SUVs flying open in unison. Sarah stepped out, the sunlight hitting her face, but she felt cold. She was about to arrest the man who had signed her paychecks, the man who had pinned her badge on her chest. She was about to kill the father figure of the city. She walked up the steps, her boots echoing on the stone, flanked by 4 agents in windbreakers emblazoned with FBI. The security guard at the metal detector, a retired cop named Old Man Holloway, stood up, his smile faltering. "Detective? What's going on? Who are these guys?" "Step aside, Holloway," Sarah said, not breaking stride. "Just step aside." They swept past him, moving through the rotunda like a storm front. The receptionists looked up from their phones, mouths dropping open. Sarah didn't look at them. Her eyes were fixed on the double mahogany doors at the end of the hall. The council chamber. She could hear the muffled sound of Sterling's voice through the wood, that deep, resonant baritone that had charmed voters for decades. He was laughing. He was in his element. Sarah reached the doors. She didn't knock. She placed both hands on the brass handles and shoved them open with a force that banged them against the inner walls, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the hushed room. The laughter died instantly. 10 heads turned. At the head of the long, polished table, Mayor Marcus Sterling froze, a pen hovering over a document. He looked at Sarah, then at the agents behind her. For a second, there was confusion. Then, recognition. And then, for the first time in 26 years, fear. It was a fleeting shadow, gone in a blink, replaced by the mask of outrage. "Detective Jenkins?" Sterling stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" "We are in session." Sarah walked into the room, the silence stretching out, heavy and brittle. She didn't stop until she was at the opposite end of the table, facing him down. The distance between them was 20 feet, but it felt like the span of a lifetime. "Marcus Sterling," she announced, her voice ringing clear and steady, bouncing off the high ceilings. "You are under arrest for the murder of Jessica Thorne." The room didn't just gasp. It imploded. The council members looked from Sarah to the mayor, their faces pale, unable to process the words. "Murder," someone whispered. "Jessica Thorne?" Sterling's face flushed a deep, angry red. He slammed his hand on the table. "This is insane. Have you lost your mind, detective? I will have your badge for this. I will have you thrown in a cell for insubordination." He looked at the agents. "Get her out of here. This woman is having a breakdown." "It's not a breakdown, Mr. Mayor," Sarah said, pulling the warrant from her jacket. "And it's not insubordination. It's a federal indictment. We have your DNA, Marcus. We have it from the scene. And right now, as we speak, Agent Miller is tossing your library. He's looking at the album. He's looking at the earring. The color drained from Sterling's face so fast it looked like the blood had been siphoned out of him. The mention of the album hit him like a physical blow. He slumped slightly, his hands gripping the edge of the table to hold himself up. The arrogance evaporated, leaving behind a naked, terrified old man. The council members saw it. They saw the shift. And in that moment, the king of Oakhaven died. "Turn around," Sarah commanded, unhooking the handcuffs from her belt. The sound of the ratchet was the loudest thing in the world. "Place your hands behind your back." Sterling stared at her, his eyes wide, vacant. He looked at the window, perhaps thinking of running, perhaps thinking of the ocean. But there was nowhere to go. The walls had closed in. Slowly, with the movements of a sleepwalker, he turned. Sarah stepped forward. She grabbed his wrists that felt frail, human, not like the iron limbs of a statue. She snapped the cuffs on. Click, click. The sound of justice, 26 years late. "You have the right to remain silent," she began, reciting the words she had said 1,000 times to drug dealers and thieves. But this time, the words felt sacred. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." She led him out of the chamber. The walk through the hallway was a blur. The employees of City Hall had gathered in the corridor, a silent, staring gauntlet. They watched their mayor, their hero, being marched out like a common criminal. There were no cheers. There were no jeers. Just a profound, stunned silence. It was the sound of a worldview shattering. As they pushed through the front doors, the media had already arrived. The scanners had picked up the raid. Cameras flashed, a blinding stroboscopic assault. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping into a wall of noise. "Mayor Sterling, is it true? Did you kill her?" "Mayor." Sterling kept his head down, staring at his shoes, the flashbulbs reflecting off his silver hair. He didn't speak. He was shoved into the back of a federal SUV, the heavy door slamming shut, sealing him away from the world he had ruled. Meanwhile, at the mansion on the cliffs, the radio crackled. "Target secure." Sarah's voice came through, tinny but triumphant. Agent Miller stood in the center of the private library, the black album open in his gloved hands. He was looking at the photo of Jessica Thorne, taken weeks before she died, unaware she was being hunted. He looked at the diamond earring, sparkling innocently under the tactical light. He keyed his mic. "We have the trophy. The case is closed." But the case wasn't just closed. It was detonated. The news broke within minutes, spreading across the state, then the country, like a wildfire fueled by shock. California mayor arrested for 1998 cold case murder. Police chief was the killer. The headlines were massive, brutal, impossible to ignore. In the coffee shops of Oakhaven, people stared at the televisions in disbelief, coffee cups forgotten in their hands. The phones at the precinct rang off the hook. The community was in a state of collective vertigo. How do you process the fact that the man who held your hand at the vigil was the one who caused the grief? How do you reconcile the protector with the predator? The shockwave hit the Thorne family hardest. Jessica's mother, now an old woman living in a small apartment 2 towns over, watched the news alone. When Sarah called her, she didn't say anything for a long time. She just breathed, a ragged, weeping sound. "I knew," she finally whispered, a voice from the grave of her memory. "I didn't know it was him. But I knew the devil was close. I always felt cold when he was near." By evening, Oakhaven was a different city. The statue in the square had been vandalized, splattered with red paint, the word "liar" scrawled across the bronze pedestal. The trust was gone. The police department was under siege, officers looking at each other with suspicion, wondering who else knew, who else was complicit. Sarah sat in her office, the adrenaline finally crashing, leaving her exhausted, hollowed out. She looked at the empty spot on the wall where Sterling's picture used to hang. Someone had already taken it down. The arrest was over. The cold case was solved. But the trial was just beginning. And as the sun set over the Pacific, painting the water the color of bruised blood, Sarah knew that the real horror wasn't the murder itself. It was the deception. It was the 26 years of smiles, of handshakes, of speeches. It was the terrifying realization that monsters don't hide under beds. They stand at podiums. They wear badges. And sometimes they are the ones we cheer for the loudest. The nightmare of Jessica Thorne was over, but the nightmare of Oakhaven's betrayal had only just begun. The interrogation room at the federal holding facility was a universe away from the mahogany-paneled office of the mayor, a stark, soundproof cube where time seemed to hang suspended in the buzzing hum of the fluorescent lights. There were no windows here, no views of the Pacific Ocean, no adoring crowds. Just a steel table bolted to the floor, 3 chairs, and a two-way mirror that reflected the distorted image of a man whose life had just been dismantled. Marcus Sterling sat on the far side of the table. They had taken his tie, his belt, and his shoelaces, standard procedure for a suicide risk, leaving him looking disheveled, a king stripped of his regalia. Yet, even in this diminished state, slumping in a plastic chair that was too small for his frame, he radiated a terrifying kind of composure. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't crying. He was waiting. He had sat on the other side of this table 1,000 times in his career. He knew the choreography of the interrogation better than the agents watching him from behind the glass. He knew that silence was a weapon, and he was wielding it with the precision of a surgeon. Detective Sarah Jenkins stood in the corner, watching him. She hadn't entered the box yet. She was letting him stew, letting the isolation work its slow, grinding magic. Agent Miller was beside her in the observation room, arms crossed, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. "He's not going to crack, Sarah," Miller muttered, his voice tinny through the speaker system. "He's a narcissist. He thinks he's smarter than us. He thinks this is a chess match, and he's 3 moves ahead." Sarah nodded slowly. She knew Miller was right. Sterling wouldn't break under pressure. He would only break under the weight of his own ego. To catch him, she didn't need to be a bully. She needed to be an audience. She needed to let him explain his masterpiece. She opened the heavy steel door and stepped inside. The air in the room was stale, recycled, smelling faintly of fear and industrial cleaner. Sterling didn't look up. He was staring at his own hands, those large, manicured hands that had strangled the life out of a teenage girl. Sarah pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down. The metal legs scraped against the linoleum, a harsh, grating sound that broke the silence. She placed a single file folder on the table. She didn't open it. She just rested her hand on it, waiting. Finally, Sterling raised his eyes. They were cold, flat, devoid of the warmth he used to project for the cameras. "Sarah," he said, his voice smooth, patronizing, as if he were scolding a rookie for a filing error. "You've made a terrible mistake. A career-ending mistake. Do you have any idea what the fallout of this will be? You've arrested a sitting mayor based on what? A stolen glass? A 20-year-old sample that was likely contaminated in the lab." He leaned forward, a shark sensing weakness. "I was at the crime scene, detective. I ran the investigation. Of course my DNA was there. Transfer. Secondary transfer. Any first-year law student could tear this apart. You have nothing." Sarah didn't blink. She didn't take the bait. She watched him with a clinical detachment that seemed to unnerve him more than anger would have. "We're not talking about transfer, Marcus," she said softly. "We're not talking about skin cells on a jacket. We're talking about the ligature. The knot. You tied it tight. You put your sweat into the fibers of the rope that killed her. That's not transfer. That's effort." Sterling scoffed, a dismissal of the science. Juries don't understand science. They understand character. And who are they going to believe? The man who built the city, or the desperate detective trying to make a name for herself? He sat back, crossing his arms. "I want my lawyer, and I want your badge." "You can have your lawyer," Sarah said, her voice remaining eerily calm. "But he can't help you with what we found in the library." The word hung in the air. Library. Sterling's eyes flickered. A microscopic twitch of the eyelid. A sudden stillness in his breathing. It was the reaction Sarah had been praying for. The crack in the porcelain. "We executed a federal search warrant at your estate an hour ago," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, forcing him to lean in. Agent Miller found the false back behind the history section. He found the album, Marcus. The black leather album. She reached into the file folder and pulled out a photocopy. It was a scan of the page with the earring. And he found this. She slid the photo across the steel table. Sterling looked at it. He didn't touch it. He stared at the image of the diamond stud earring, taped to the page like a butterfly pinned to a board. The color drained from his face, leaving it gray and waxen. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. The arrogant politician was gone. In his place was something far more primal. He looked like a man whose soul had been exposed to the sunlight. "It's a match," Sarah said, hammering the nail in. "The serial number on the diamond matches the purchase record from 1997. It's Jessica's earring. The one you reported missing. The one you kept." Sterling didn't speak. He couldn't. The narrative he had built for 26 years, the grieving chief, the tireless crusader, had just been incinerated. There was no defense for this. There was no transfer explanation for a trophy locked in a secret safe. The silence in the room stretched, becoming heavy and suffocating. Sarah watched the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was calculating. He was realizing that the legal battle was lost. The not guilty plea was dead. Now he was left with only one thing, his vanity. Slowly, a change came over him. His posture shifted. He stopped slumping. He sat up straighter, but not with the stiffness of a politician. He sat up with the regal, twisted pride of a creator. A dark, chilling smile touched the corners of his lips. He looked at the photo of the earring not with fear, but with nostalgia. "She was beautiful," he whispered. The voice was different now. It wasn't the mayor's voice. It was lower, wetter, filled with a terrifying intimacy. "You never knew her, Sarah. You saw the body. You saw the pictures in the file. But you didn't see her. She was incandescent. She was too bright for this town. Too bright for that mundane life she was living." Sarah felt a shiver crawl up her spine, a physical reaction to the evil radiating from him. She kept her face neutral. "Is that why you killed her? Because she was bright?" Sterling laughed softly, a dry, rattling sound. "Killed her? That's such a crude word. A policeman's word. I didn't kill her. I preserved her." He looked up at the mirror, as if addressing the world beyond. She was going to leave, you know. She was going to go to college. She was going to grow up. She was going to become ordinary. She would have married some insurance salesman, got fat, got old, lost that light. I couldn't let that happen. Perfection is fleeting, detective. Unless you capture it. He was confessing, not out of guilt, but out of a need to be understood. He wanted credit for his work. The monster was bragging. "Tell me about that night," Sarah said, her recorder's red light blinking like a single, unblinking eye. "Tell me how you captured her." Sterling leaned back, his eyes unfocusing, drifting back to 1998. "The fog," he murmured. "It was a gift. A blanket for the world. I saw her walking near the cliff. She was upset. Some boy trouble. Trivial teenage nonsense. I pulled over. She knew me. 'Chief Sterling,' she said. She smiled. She trusted me. Everyone trusts me. That's the power, Sarah. The badge isn't metal. It's a key. It opens every door. It lowers every defense." He traced the edge of the table with his finger. "I offered her a ride. But I didn't take her home. I drove to the turnout. We talked. I told her she was special. I told her she was an angel. And when I put the cord around her neck, she didn't fight. Not really. It was like she knew. It was quiet. There was no anger. Just silence. I made her silent. And then I laid her out. I fixed her hair. I folded her hands. I made her a masterpiece." Sarah felt bile rising in her throat. He was describing a murder as if it were an art installation. He felt no remorse. He felt accomplishment. "And the investigation?" she asked, her voice tight. "You led the hunt for yourself." "Of course," Sterling smiled, a look of pure arrogance. Who better? I knew where the clues were because I put them there. Or didn't put them there. It was a game, Sarah. Me against the world. And I was winning. For 26 years, I won. I watched you all running in circles. I watched the parents cry. I comforted them. I felt their pain, truly. But I also felt powerful. I held the secret that could destroy the city, and I kept it in my pocket. It was intoxicating. He looked at the photo of the earring again. I kept this to remember the moment she stopped being a girl and became mine, forever mine. Sarah stood up. She couldn't sit there anymore. The air in the room felt poisoned. She had the confession. She had the details that only the killer would know. She had the monster on tape. "You're not a masterpiece, Marcus," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You're just a sad, sick old man who hurt a child. And you're going to die in a cage, forgotten. That's your legacy. Not the statue. Not the park. Just this. Just a number in a file." Sterling's smile faltered. For the first time, the reality of his future pierced his delusion. The cage. The oblivion. He looked at Sarah, and the light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a sudden, vast emptiness. The California 1998 cold case was solved, but the cost of the truth was staring Sarah in the face. She turned and walked to the door. "Detective," Sterling called out, his voice cracking slightly. Sarah paused, her hand on the handle. She didn't look back. Did I at least make the headlines?" he asked. "Is it big?" Sarah opened the door. "It's big, Marcus. It's the biggest thing you've ever done. And it's the last time anyone will ever speak your name." She stepped out and the heavy steel door slammed shut, sealing the tomb. In the observation room, Agent Miller let out a long, heavy breath. "We got him," he whispered. "God help us, we got him." But Sarah didn't celebrate. She walked down the hallway, past the holding cells, past the guards. She needed to breathe. She needed to wash the sound of his voice off her skin. The psychological unraveling of Marcus Sterling was complete, but he had taken a piece of Oakhaven's soul with him. The case was closed, but the haunting was permanent. The monster was behind bars, but the question remained: how many other monsters were hiding in plain sight, wearing suits, shaking hands, and smiling into the cameras? The arrest shocked the community, but the confession would break its heart. The true horror wasn't that the killer was a stranger. It was that he was the one they had trusted to keep the darkness away. The Superior Court of California, County of Oakhaven, was never designed to hold the weight of history. It was a building of beige stucco and mid-century optimism, constructed for traffic tickets and zoning disputes, not for the exorcism of a city's demons. But on the morning of June 12th, the courthouse square was transformed into a carnival of the grotesque. Satellite trucks from every major news network in the globe formed a steel barricade around the perimeter, their dishes pointed at the sky like begging hands. The sidewalk was a sea of faces, protesters holding signs that read "Justice for Jessica" and "Betrayal," clashing with a dwindling but vocal minority of Sterling loyalists who held placards screaming "Frame job" and "Free the mayor." The air was thick with the smell of generator exhaust and the electric hum of a community on the brink of a nervous breakdown. This wasn't just a trial, it was the Oakhaven cold case finale, televised live to a horrified nation. Inside, Department 4 was packed to the rafters. Every seat in the gallery was filled by lottery, a golden ticket to the autopsy of a reputation. The front row was reserved for the Thorne family. Jessica's mother, frail and trembling, sat clutching a framed photograph of her daughter, her eyes fixed on the empty defense table. She was the anchor of the room, the silent moral compass in a storm of legal rhetoric. And then the side door opened. A hush fell over the room, so sudden and absolute it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the ventilation system. Marcus Sterling entered. He was not wearing the orange jumpsuit of a prisoner. His high-priced defense team, a phalanx of suits from Los Angeles led by the infamous fix-it attorney, Robert the Razor Vance, had successfully petitioned for him to wear civilian clothes. He walked in wearing a charcoal gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and a navy tie. He looked distinguished. He looked authoritative. He looked like the mayor. He didn't shuffle. He strode, despite the slight limp caused by the leg shackles hidden beneath his trousers. He scanned the gallery, nodding to a former council member, locking eyes with the jury box. He was playing the part of the wrongfully accused statesman, the martyr on the cross of public opinion. He sat down, adjusted his cuffs, and looked up at the judge with an expression of polite patience. The prosecution was led by Special Prosecutor David Rourke, a man brought in from Sacramento to avoid any conflict of interest. Rourke was the antithesis of Sterling. Where Sterling was polished and expansive, Rourke was compact, sharp, and utterly devoid of charm. He was a hunter. He stood up for his opening statement, walking to the jury box without a single note in his hand. He looked the 12 jurors in the eye, 7 men, 5 women, all of whom had lived in Oakhaven under Sterling's reign. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rourke began, his voice dry and cutting. "You know this man. You have voted for him. You have cheered for him. You have trusted him with your safety. But the man you know is a fiction. The man sitting at that table is a character played by an actor. And the play is a tragedy written in the blood of a 17-year-old girl." Rourke didn't scream. He simply laid out the timeline. He painted the picture of the fog, the ride, the strangulation. He spoke of the silence. He didn't panic, Rourke told the jury. He didn't flee. He posed her. He arranged her hair. He treated the murder scene like a flower arrangement. And then, he went to work and led the hunt for himself. The defense's turn was a masterclass in gaslighting. Robert Vance stood up, buttoning his jacket, smiling warmly at the jury. "The prosecution has a story," Vance purred. "A horrific, terrifying story. But that's all it is. A story. Where are the witnesses? There are none. Where is the weapon? There is none. All they have is a speck of DNA, invisible, easily transferred, easily planted, and an album found in a room that dozens of people had access to. They are asking you to destroy a hero based on dust and conjecture." The trial that followed was a grueling, 2-week war of attrition. The prosecution called the forensic experts. The geneticist from Virginia testified about the 1 in 4.8 quintillion probability. He explained the family tree. He explained the science that couldn't lie. The jury listened, taking notes, but their faces were unreadable. Science is cold. Sterling was warm. The defense hammered the contamination theory. "Isn't it true," Vance shouted at the lab technician, "that Chief Sterling was at the scene? That he touched the body to check for a pulse? That his DNA could have ended up on the ligature through secondary transfer?" The technician stammered, admitting it was theoretically possible, though highly unlikely. Vance smiled at the jury. "Reasonable doubt," he whispered. Then came the trophy. The black album. When Rourke brought it out, sealing it in a plastic evidence bag, the temperature in the room dropped. He projected the images onto the courtroom screen. The stalker photos. The clippings. And finally, the earring. The defense argued that the album was planted by political enemies or a rogue detective looking for glory, casting a side eye at Sarah Jenkins, who sat in the back row. But Rourke called the antique jeweler who had sold the earrings to Jessica's father in 1997. The old man, squinting through thick glasses, confirmed the unique serial number etched microscopically on the post. "That is the earring," he said. "I sold it to Mr. Thorne for Jessica's 16th birthday." The weight of the evidence was crushing, yet Sterling remained unmoved. He took notes. He whispered to his lawyers. He looked like a man bored by the proceedings. And then, against the frantic, whispered advice of his legal team, he made the move that would define the trial. He raised his hand. "Your Honor," Sterling's voice boomed, bypassing his lawyer. "I wish to testify." The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, demanding order. Vance buried his face in his hands. It is the cardinal rule of defense. Never put the monster on the stand. But a narcissist cannot sit silently while others tell a story. Sterling believed he could charm the jury. He believed he was smarter than Rourke. He believed he was invincible. Sterling took the stand. He swore to tell the truth. He sat in the witness chair, elevated above the room, and for a moment, It looked like he was back at a podium giving a State of the City address. He was eloquent. He was passionate. He looked at the jury and spoke of his love for Oakhaven, his dedication to the law. He cried actual tears when he spoke of finding Jessica's body. "It broke my heart," he said, his voice trembling with practiced emotion. "I vowed to find her killer. And now they accuse me? It is the ultimate betrayal." The jury was captivated. Some of them looked sympathetic. He was good. He was terrifyingly good. Then, David Rourke stood up for cross-examination. He didn't attack immediately. He started slow. He asked about Sterling's career, his awards, his routine. He lulled him into a rhythm of agreement. Sterling relaxed. He became expansive, arrogant. "You consider yourself a detail-oriented man, Mr. Sterling?" Rourke asked. "I have to be. The safety of the city depends on it." "And you remember that night clearly? November 14th, 1998. Like it was yesterday. It is burned into my soul." "You said in your direct testimony that you checked her pulse," Rourke said, flipping through a transcript. "That you touched her neck to check for life." "I did. I am a first responder." "But in your original police report from 1998, Rourke said, projecting the document on the screen, you wrote, "I arrived at 010. Officer Miller had already confirmed the victim was deceased. I secured the perimeter. I did not disturb the body until the coroner arrived." Rourke looked up. "So, which is it, Marcus? Did you touch her to save her? Or did you stand back to preserve the scene?" Sterling blinked. A flash of irritation crossed his face. It was chaos. "I might have misremembered the exact sequence in the report, but I checked her." "You misremembered the most important detail of the night?" Rourke pressed. "Or are you changing your story now to explain why your skin cells were compressed into the knots of the rope?" "I am not changing anything," Sterling snapped, his voice rising. "I was doing my job. Let's talk about the album." Rourke pivoted. "You say it was planted. By whom?" "By her." Sterling pointed a shaking finger at Sarah Jenkins in the gallery. "She broke into my house. She has a vendetta." "Detective Jenkins found it," Rourke corrected. "But she didn't make it. Tell me, Marcus, in the photo on page 12, the one of Jessica walking to school, there is a reflection in the shop window behind her. A reflection of the photographer's car." Rourke clicked a button. The image on the screen zoomed in. Grainy but distinct. A black sedan. And in the side mirror of the sedan, a face. It was blurry. It was partial. But it was him. A younger, dark-haired Marcus Sterling, holding a camera. The courtroom gasped. Sterling stared at the screen. He hadn't seen this enhancement. He hadn't known. "Is that a plant, Marcus?" Rourke asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Did Detective Jenkins travel back in time to 1998 and Photoshop your face into a reflection?" Sterling was silent. His mouth worked, but no sound came out. The charm was evaporating. The mask was slipping. "You liked watching her, didn't you?" Rourke pushed, stepping closer to the witness stand. "You felt like you owned her." "I was protecting her," Sterling shouted, losing control. "I was watching over the city. I watch over everyone." "You killed her because she was going to leave," Rourke said, quoting the confession from the interrogation, words that hadn't been played for the jury yet, but were now being baited out of him live. "You wanted to keep her perfect." "She was perfect," Sterling roared, slamming his hand on the railing. "And she would have been ruined by this filth. By boys. By life. I saved her. I gave her immortality." The silence that followed was absolute. The jury stared at him in horror. The defense attorney closed his eyes. Sterling froze, realizing what he had just said. He looked around the room, seeing the shock, the disgust. He saw the faces of the voters who had loved him, now looking at him like he was a monster. He tried to backtrack. I saved her memory. No more questions, Rourke said, turning his back on him. Sterling sat there, breathing heavily, the sweat glistening on his forehead. He looked small. He looked old. The king of Oakhaven had just abdicated his throne on live television. The theater of lies had collapsed, and the curtain had fallen, revealing the stage to be empty, save for one lonely, twisted man. The judge called for a recess. As the bailiff led Sterling down from the stand, he didn't look at the gallery. He didn't look at the jury. He looked at the floor. But as he passed the prosecution table, he stopped for a fraction of a second. He looked at the photo of Jessica Thorne on the desk. And for a brief, terrifying moment, a look of longing crossed his face. He missed his trophy. He missed his kill. The doors closed behind him, but the damage was done. The trial of the century was effectively over. The jury had seen the beast. Now they just had to name him. The city of Oakhaven waited for the verdict, but in the hearts of the people, the judgment had already been passed. The cold case was solved, but the scar it left behind was throbbing, a wound that no gavel could ever truly heal. The jury deliberation room was a vacuum of sound, a sealed chamber where 12 ordinary citizens were tasked with deciding the fate of a man who had once been their god. In most murder trials, deliberations can stretch for days, weeks even, as jurors wrestle with the nuances of reasonable doubt, parsing through grainy surveillance footage and conflicting witness statements. But the case of the people versus Marcus Sterling was not most trials. The evidence hadn't just been presented, it had been confessed. The image of the mayor on the witness stand, shouting about immortality and saving the victim, had seared itself into the collective consciousness of the jury like a brand. There was no debate about the facts. There was only a collective need to process the horror. They didn't need to review the DNA charts. They didn't need to look at the Black Album again. They just needed to look at each other and acknowledge the darkness they had all witnessed. For hours. That was all it took. 4 hours to dismantle a 30-year legacy. 4 hours to turn a hero into a convict. When the buzzer sounded in Department 4, signaling that a verdict had been reached, the sound was like a thunderclap in the tense silence of the hallway. The words spread instantly, a digital contagion leaping from cell phone to cell phone, from the courtroom clerks to the news vans outside. Verdict is in. They're coming back. The air in Oakhaven became electric, charged with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Shopkeepers turned their open signs to closed and gathered around radios and televisions. Traffic seemed to slow. The entire city held its breath, turning its face toward the courthouse, waiting for the final act of the tragedy to be written. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air conditioning struggled against the body heat of the packed gallery. Judge Harrison returned to the bench, his face grim, his eyes tired. He looked like a man who had seen too much, who had peered into the abyss and was struggling to pull himself back. The jury filed in, their faces solemn, avoiding eye contact with the defense table. They looked like pallbearers at a funeral. Marcus Sterling stood up. He was no longer the defiant titan who had roared on the stand. He was diminished, shrunken inside his expensive suit. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his posture rigid. He knew what was coming. The arrogance had burned off, leaving only the cold, hard ash of reality. Mr. Foreman. The judge's voice was a low rumble. Has the jury reached a verdict? A middle-aged man in a plaid shirt, a high school teacher who had once voted for Sterling, stood up. His hands were shaking as he held the paper. We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a cough, not a rustle of fabric. It was a silence, so deep you could hear the heartbeat of the city itself. In the matter of the people of California versus Marcus Sterling, the foreman began, his voice wavering but gaining strength with every word. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The word hung in the air, vibrating like a struck bell. Guilty. A sob broke the silence, a raw, guttural sound from the front row. It was Jessica Thorne's mother. She didn't cheer. She didn't pump her fist. She simply collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands, her body shaking with the release of 26 years of agony. It was the sound of a dam breaking. Beside her, Detective Sarah Jenkins placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, tears streaming silently down her own face. It wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a moment of profound, exhausting relief. The ghost could finally rest. Sterling didn't move. He didn't flinch. He stared straight ahead at the empty space above the jury box, his face a mask of stone. But those close to him saw the light go out in his eyes. The last ember of the mayor was extinguished. He was just a number now. The foreman wasn't finished. On the special circumstance allegation of lying in wait. True. On the special circumstance allegation of murder for financial gain. Not true. On the count of obstruction of justice. Guilty. The hammer blows continued, each guilty, adding another lock to the cage. When it was over, Judge Harrison looked at Sterling. The judge didn't mask his contempt. He didn't offer the usual judicial platitudes. "Marcus Sterling," he said, his voice dripping with ice. "You are remanded to the custody of the sheriff without bail. Sentencing is set for July 15th. Take him away." 2 bailiffs moved in. They didn't treat him with the deference usually reserved for former law enforcement. They were rough. They pulled his arms behind his back, clicking the handcuffs into place with a definitive snap. Sterling looked up then, scanning the room one last time. He looked for a friendly face. He looked for a supporter. He found none. He saw only disgust. He saw the faces of the people he had betrayed. As he was led out the side door, the king of Oakhaven looked like a confused old man lost in a storm of his own making. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was chaotic. As the news broke, a roar went up from the crowd, not a cheer of joy, but a primal scream of vindication. Guilty. The chant started low and built into a deafening crescendo. Guilty. 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 People hugged strangers. Some wept openly. The tension that had gripped the community for months finally snapped, replaced by a cathartic release. But amidst the noise, there was a somber undercurrent. Because Oakhaven wasn't just celebrating a conviction, it was mourning an identity. Their leader was a monster. Their history was a lie. The victory was Pyrrhic. Sarah Jenkins walked out of the courthouse an hour later, blinking in the harsh afternoon sunlight. The media swarm descended on her. Microphones thrust into her face like spears. "Detective, how do you feel?" "Detective, what does this mean for the department?" "Sarah, over here." She stopped on the steps, looking out at the sea of cameras. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, but her spine was steel. She adjusted the microphone stand, the feedback whining briefly. "Today isn't about Marcus Sterling," she said, her voice cutting through the clamor. "He has taken enough of our time. He has taken enough of our attention. Today is about Jessica. It's about a 17-year-old girl who wanted to go to college, who wanted to see the world, and who had that stolen from her by a man who thought he was God. Today, we learned that no badge is brighter than the truth. No title is higher than the law. The cold case is closed. Jessica is going home." She stepped back, refusing further questions, walking through the parting crowd toward her car. She needed silence. She needed to drive to the coast and listen to the waves, the only thing in Oakhaven that hadn't lied to her. But the city couldn't just move on. The verdict was the end of the legal battle, but the beginning of the purge. That very evening, an emergency session of the city council was called. The agenda was short: the erasure of Marcus Sterling. Under the cover of darkness, a work crew was dispatched to the plaza in front of City Hall. A crane rumbled into position next to the bronze statue of the mayor, the statue that depicted him pointing heroically toward the future. A crowd gathered to watch, silent and grim. A welder climbed the ladder, sparks flying into the night air as he cut through the bolts at the base. A heavy chain was wrapped around the bronze neck, a poetic justice that was not lost on the onlookers. The engine of the crane groaned, the cable tightened, and with a screech of tearing metal, the statue was ripped from its pedestal. It swung in the air for a moment, a hanged man made of metal, before being lowered unceremoniously onto a flatbed truck. The crowd didn't cheer. They just watched. It was like watching a funeral for the town's soul. The Marcus Sterling Police Academy sign was covered with a tarp. The Sterling Public Library plaque was pried off the wall with crowbars. The city was scrubbing itself clean, trying to wash away the stain of his name. But you can't scrub away memory. Every time a resident walked past the empty plinth in the square, they would remember. Every time they saw a police car, they would wonder. The trust was shattered, and it would take generations to rebuild. The impact on the police department was catastrophic. The Attorney General's office announced a full audit of every case Sterling had ever touched. Hundreds of convictions were now in jeopardy. Defense attorneys were already filing appeals, claiming their clients were framed by a corrupt chief. The Sterling era was being dismantled brick by brick. Good officers, men and women who had served with honor, were spat on in the street, guilty by association. The badge, once a symbol of pride, had become a target. Sarah Jenkins was promoted to lieutenant, placed in charge of the chaotic restructuring, but it was a poisoned chalice. She was the captain of a sinking ship, trying to bail out the water while the ocean raged around her. And in the county jail, in a solitary cell isolated from the general population, Marcus Sterling sat on a thin mattress. He had no suit. He had no tie. He wore the orange jumpsuit of a state prisoner, the number on his chest replacing his name. The cell was 6 by 8 feet. The walls were gray concrete. There was no audience here. No jury to charm. No voters to woo. Just the silence. He stared at the wall, his mind likely replaying the trial, rewriting the script, convincing himself that he was the victim of a grand conspiracy. The narcissist never accepts defeat. He only accepts martyrdom. He probably told himself that the world wasn't ready for his genius, that they couldn't understand the art of his crime. But as the lights flickered out for the night, leaving him in the dark, the reality was inescapable. He was alone. The girl he had saved was everywhere, on the news, in the papers, in the hearts of the people. She was alive in memory. He was the one who was dead. The Oakhaven 1998 cold case was technically solved, but the file would never truly be closed. It had become a scar on the map of California, a cautionary tale whispered in police academies and law schools. It taught the world a terrifying lesson, that the face of evil isn't always a snarling beast in the shadows. Sometimes, it's the face smiling at you from the front page of the newspaper. Sometimes, the monster is the man holding the keys to the city. As the weeks turned into months, the initial shock faded into a dull, aching bruise. The flowers at the base of the empty statue wilted. The news vans moved on to the next tragedy. But for Sarah Jenkins and for the family of Jessica Thorne, the silence was finally peaceful. The fog still rolled in off the Pacific, blanketing the town in white, but it no longer felt like a shroud. It felt like a clean slate, a blank page. Oakhaven was broken, yes. But for the first time in 26 years, it was honest. The summer heat in Oakhaven that July was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down on the scorched pavement and the wilting palm trees, turning the air inside the Superior Court into a stagnant, breathless soup despite the laboring air conditioners. It was July 15th, the day of reckoning. If the trial had been a theater of war, the sentencing hearing was the aftermath, the somber walk through the battlefield to count the dead and bury the past. The frenzy of the verdict had dissipated, replaced by a grim, ritualistic solemnity. The crowds outside were smaller now, stripped of the sign-waving hysteria, replaced by a silent vigil of citizens who simply needed to see the end. They needed to see the coffin lid nailed shut. Inside Department 4, the gallery was packed once again, but the energy was different. It wasn't the electric buzz of suspense. It was the heavy, suffocating gravity of judgment. Marcus Sterling sat at the defense table, a solitary figure in an orange jumpsuit that seemed to vibrate against the muted wood tones of the courtroom. The charcoal suits were gone. The silk ties were gone. The illusion of the statesman had been stripped away, leaving only the inmate. He was shackled at the waist and ankles, the chains clinking softly every time he shifted in his chair, a sound that served as a constant, metallic reminder of his new reality. He looked older than he had just a month ago. His skin was pasty, deprived of the coastal sun, and his silver hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and unkempt. But his eyes remained unchanged. They were hard, flinty, staring straight ahead at the judge's bench, refusing to acknowledge the gallery behind him. He refused to look at the people he had governed. He refused to look at the woman sitting in the front row, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in her trembling hands. The proceedings began with the procedural dryness of the law, motions denied, objections overruled, a bureaucratic prelude to the emotional storm that was brewing. Judge Harrison, looking like an Old Testament figure in his black robes, dispensed with the formalities quickly. He knew what this day was about. It wasn't about legal statutes, it was about voice. For 26 years, Marcus Sterling had controlled the narrative. He had spoken for the victim. He had spoken for the city. Today, he would be forced to listen. Today, the microphone belonged to the people he had destroyed. The court will now hear victim impact statements, the judge announced, his voice echoing in the hush. Mrs. Thorne, please approach. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor was deafening. Jessica's mother stood up. She was a small woman, shrunken by decades of grief, her spine curved as if carrying an invisible stone. She walked to the podium slowly, her hand gripping the wooden rail for support. She adjusted the microphone, the feedback whining briefly, a harsh sound that made the jury wince. She took a breath, a ragged intake of air that sounded like it hurt. She didn't look at the judge. She turned her body, slowly, deliberately, until she was facing the defense table. She looked directly at the back of Marcus Sterling's head. "Look at me," she whispered. Sterling didn't move. He stared at the water pitcher on his table. "Look at me." Her voice cracked, rising into a command that startled the bailiffs. Slowly, with an air of immense boredom, Sterling turned his head. He met her gaze. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a dull irritation, as if she were a constituent complaining about a pothole. "You called her a masterpiece," Mrs. Thorne began, her voice shaking but gaining strength with every syllable. "I heard you on the stand. You said you saved her. You said you kept her perfect." She held up the photo of Jessica, not the studio portrait the news used, but a candid shot of a girl with messy hair, laughing, with chocolate on her chin. "This is not a masterpiece, Marcus. This is a mess." She was messy. She was loud. She left wet towels on the floor. She burned the toast. She listened to terrible music that shook the walls. She was rude sometimes. She was selfish sometimes. She was human. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. You didn't save her from anything. You stole her mess. You stole her mistakes. You stole the woman she was supposed to become. You think you're an artist? You think you're a guardian? She leaned into the microphone, her voice dropping to a hiss that carried to the back of the room. "You are nothing but a thief. A petty, small thief who took the only thing I had because you were afraid of your own insignificance. You wanted to own something beautiful because you are so incredibly ugly inside." The courtroom was frozen. The air felt charged, radioactive. Sterling's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. She had pierced the armor. She hadn't called him a monster. Monster implies power. She had called him a thief. She had called him small. "I have hated the fog for 26 years, Mrs. Thorne continued, her voice breaking. "Because I thought the fog took her. But it wasn't the fog. It was you. And now I look at you in your chains, in your orange suit, and I don't feel hate anymore. I feel pity. Because Jessica is still loved. She is still remembered by a whole city. But you? When they close that door today, Marcus, nobody is going to remember you. You are going to rot in the dark, and the world is going to keep spinning, and the sun is going to keep shining, and you'll be nothing." She stepped back from the podium, leaving the silence to settle over him like a shroud. She walked back to her seat, collapsing into the arms of Sarah Jenkins, her body shaking with the release of the venom she had carried for half a lifetime. Sterling turned back to the front. He looked unperturbed, but his hands were clenched so tightly in his lap that his fingernails were digging into his palms. The judge looked at him. "Does the defendant wish to make a statement before sentencing?" This was the moment. The allocution. The chance for an apology. The chance for a sliver of humanity. Sterling stood up. The chains rattled loudly. He smoothed the front of his jumpsuit, as if it were a tuxedo. He cleared his throat. He looked at the judge, then he turned and looked at the gallery. He scanned the faces of the reporters, the former officers, the citizens. He stood tall, summoning the ghost of the mayor one last time. "I have served this city for 40 years, Sterling said, his voice deep and resonant, filling the room. "I have given my blood, my sweat, and my life to Oakhaven. I patrolled these streets when most of you were in diapers. I built the precinct. I lowered the crime rate. I made you safe." He paused, letting the words hang. There was no apology coming. "It is a tragedy what happened to Jessica Thorne," he continued, his tone shifting to one of clinical detachment. "A tragedy. But the greater tragedy is what is happening here today. You are crucifying the man who protected you. You are tearing down the pillars of your own society because of a misunderstanding, a misinterpretation of a complex situation." A gasp went through the room. A misunderstanding. He was calling a strangulation a misunderstanding. "I do not ask for your forgiveness," Sterling said, his voice hardening, his eyes flashing with a sudden, terrifying anger. "Because you are not worthy of judging me. You sleep safely in your beds because men like me stand on the wall. And now you throw me to the wolves? Shame on you. Shame on this city. I did what I did for reasons you cannot comprehend. I created order out of chaos. And if I had to do it all again, I would still be the man who made the hard choices." He sat down. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of horror. He hadn't just refused to apologize. He had doubled down. He had declared himself above the moral law of the common man. He had revealed the true depth of his sociopathy. He believed he was a martyr. Judge Harrison stared at him for a long time. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to grow louder, measuring out the remaining seconds of Marcus Sterling's life as a free man. The judge shuffled his papers, stacking them neatly. He removed his reading glasses and leaned forward, his face etched with a mixture of disgust and sorrow. "Mr. Sterling," the judge began, his voice low and dangerous. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen murderers, rapists, gang members, and cartel hitmen. I have seen the worst of humanity. But I have never, until this moment, seen a man so completely hollow." The judge picked up the sentencing document. "You speak of service. You speak of protection. But you used your badge as a hunting license. You used your authority as a camouflage for your perversion. You didn't protect this city. You preyed on it. You held a grieving mother's hand while wearing the trophy of her daughter's murder in your cufflink box. That is not service. That is sadism." Harrison's voice rose, filling the courtroom with the weight of the law. "You are not a pillar of society, Mr. Sterling. You are a crack in the foundation. And today, we fill that crack with concrete. You wanted immortality. You wanted to be remembered? You will be remembered as the man who betrayed everything he swore to uphold." The judge looked down at the paper. "For the crime of murder in the first degree, with a special circumstance of lying in wait, I sentence you to a term of life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the crime of obstruction of justice, I sentence you to the maximum term of 5 years, to be served consecutively. You are stripped of all rank, all pension, and all honors." The gavel came down. Bang! It wasn't a loud sound, but it felt like the closing of a coffin. Life without parole. He would die in a concrete box. He would never see the ocean again. He would never drink scotch again. He would never hear the applause again. "Remand the defendant," the judge ordered. The bailiffs moved in instantly, hauling Sterling to his feet. This time, he didn't walk with dignity. He stumbled slightly as they pulled him toward the side door, the door that led to the holding cells, and then to the transport bus, and then to the state penitentiary. He tried to stop, tried to turn back to the gallery, perhaps to shout one last insult, one last desperate assertion of his power. But the bailiffs shoved him forward. "Move it, inmate," one of them growled, a young deputy who had grown up idolizing Chief Sterling, now looking at him like he was garbage. Sterling was pushed through the door. For a split second, before it closed, Sarah Jenkins caught a glimpse of his face. The mask had finally shattered completely. There was panic there. Stark, animal panic. He realized, finally, that the game was over. The door slammed shut with a heavy, metallic thud that resonated through the floorboards. The courtroom exhaled. It was a collective release of breath, a physical lowering of shoulders. It was over. Sarah turned to Mrs. Thorne. The older woman was weeping, but these were different tears. They were tears of exhaustion, of finality. "He's gone," Sarah whispered, squeezing her hand. "He's really gone." "He's gone," Mrs. Thorne repeated, her voice sounding stronger than it had in years. "And Jessica is still here." They walked out of the courtroom together, arm in arm, ignoring the shouting reporters, ignoring the cameras. They walked out into the blinding July sun. The heat was still oppressive, but the air felt cleaner. The statue was gone from the plaza. The name was being scrubbed from the buildings. The city of Oakhaven was wounded, scarred, and humbled, but it was free. As Sarah stood on the courthouse steps, watching the black transport van pull away from the loading dock, carrying the former king of Oakhaven to his cage, she didn't feel triumph. She felt a deep, abiding fatigue. The cold case was solved, but the warmth of justice was a slow burn. She looked at the horizon, where the fog was waiting to roll in for the evening. It would come tonight, just like it always did. But tonight, it wouldn't be hiding a monster. Tonight, it would just be weather. And that, Sarah thought as she walked toward her car, was the greatest victory of all. The restoration of the ordinary. The return of the mundane. The silence of a night where the only thing to fear was the dark itself, not the man who owned it. The weeks following the sentencing didn't bring the immediate peace the movies promised. Instead, Oakhaven felt like a city recovering from a massive, silent earthquake. The structural damage wasn't in the buildings, but in the belief systems of every man, woman, and child who called the coast their home. The California 1998 cold case was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a ghost that had finally been given a name, and that name was written on every street corner. Detective Sarah Jenkins, now Lieutenant Jenkins, found herself at the center of a reconstruction project that felt more like a forensic cleanup of a crime scene that spanned 3 decades. Her office was no longer in the basement. She had been moved to the 3rd floor, into the very wing where Marcus Sterling had once held court. But the air there still felt heavy, saturated with the residue of his presence. She refused to sit in his old chair. She had hauled to the city dump on her first day, watching the hydraulic press crush the expensive leather into a pancake of twisted metal and stuffing. It was a small, symbolic victory in a war that had no real winners. The department was in a state of paralysis. Internal Affairs, backed by federal monitors, had set up a permanent camp in the briefing room. Every file, every memo, every disciplinary record signed by Sterling was being scrutinized under a microscope. The fallout was devastating. 3 veteran detectives, men who had been Sterling's inner circle, were placed on administrative leave within a month. They weren't accused of murder, but of something almost as corrosive: willful blindness. They had seen the inconsistencies in the 1998 investigation and looked the other way. They had heard the whispers and turned up the radio. The blue wall of silence hadn't just protected a killer, it had nourished him. Sarah watched as the men she once respected were escorted from the building, their badges surrendered, their faces masks of shame. The purge was necessary, but it left the precinct feeling hollow, a skeleton of an organization. Outside the station, the city was rebranding itself with a desperate, frantic energy. A new city ordinance was passed in record time, the Sterling Erasure Act. Every park, every library, and every scholarship fund bearing his name was renamed within 90 days. The Oakhaven Police Academy became the Oakhaven Public Safety Center. Sterling Street was renamed Thorn Way. It was an attempt to lobotomize the city's memory, to cut out the cancer and pretend the body had always been whole. But the scars were everywhere. You could see them in the way people looked at a patrol car now, not with a wave or a nod, but with a guarded, suspicious squint. You could see it in the town hall meetings, where the new interim mayor was shouted down by citizens demanding to know how Monster could hide in plain sight for 26 years. The shock had turned into a slow-boiling rage, a collective sense of betrayal that wouldn't be mollified by new street signs. For Sarah, the personal cost was high. She was a hero to the public, the relentless detective who had taken down the king. But within the walls of the precinct, she was a pariah to some, the woman who had broken the brotherhood. She received anonymous hang-up calls at midnight. Her tires were slashed in the parking lot. The loyalty to Sterling ran deep, a cult of personality that didn't die just because the leader was in a cage. She found herself eating lunch alone, the cafeteria falling silent when she entered. She had traded her anonymity and her professional comfort for the truth, and the truth was a lonely place to live. She spent her evenings at the Thorne house, sitting on the porch with Jessica's mother, watching the sunset. They didn't talk much about the case anymore. They talked about the garden. They talked about the weather. They talked about the silence that was finally, mercifully, just silence. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the precinct, postmarked from the state penitentiary. It was addressed to Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins. She held the envelope in her hand, feeling a familiar chill. The handwriting was elegant, precise, the script of a man who took pride in his penmanship. She didn't open it in her office. She drove down to the cliffs, to the very spot at mile marker 42 where the nightmare had begun. The wind was whipping off the Pacific, smelling of salt and decay. She sat on the hood of her car and tore the envelope open. "Detective," it began. He still refused to use her new rank. "I hear they're taking my name off the buildings. I hear they are melting down my statue. They think that by removing the bronze, they can remove the man. How quaint. They don't realize that I am the architect of their peace. Every night they slept soundly for 26 years. They slept because of me. I am the shadow that allowed them to live in the light. You think you've won, Sarah. You think you've delivered justice. But all you've done is reveal the void. Look at your city. It is broken. It is afraid. It is leaderless. You haven't freed them. You've orphaned them. And every time a child looks at a policeman and feels fear, they are thinking of me. I am the permanent resident of Oakhaven's mind. You cannot erase what I created. I am the fog. I am the ocean. I am the truth they weren't strong enough to hear. Enjoy your promotion. It was paid for in my blood." Sarah read the letter twice, then pulled a lighter from her pocket. She held the flame to the corner of the paper, watching the elegant script curl and blacken. The words turned to ash, caught by the sea breeze and scattered over the edge of the cliff. She didn't feel angry. She felt a profound sense of closure. Sterling was still trying to be the protagonist of the story, still trying to claim ownership of the city's soul. But he was wrong. The city wasn't orphaned. It was waking up. The fear wasn't a sign of his power. It was the birth pains of a new kind of vigilance. The California 1998 cold case was no longer his masterpiece. It was his epitaph. She looked down at the spot where Jessica had been found. A small, permanent memorial had been built there. Not a statue, but a simple bench made of driftwood and stone, facing the sea. On it was a small plaque, for the girl who reminded us to look closer. There were fresh flowers on the bench. There was a high school yearbook. There was a life being remembered, not a death being fetishized. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah felt the first tendrils of the evening fog rolling in. It touched her face, cold and damp. For 26 years, this fog had been the accomplice of a killer. It had hidden the struggle, masked the movements of a predator, and provided the shroud for a victim. But as Sarah stood there, she realized the fog was just water and air. It had no loyalty. It had no memory. It was just part of the world. And the world was moving on. She got back in her car and started the engine. She had work to do. There were other boxes in that basement, other names waiting for their voices back. The Oakhaven 1998 cold case was solved, but the legacy of the investigation was just beginning. She wasn't just a detective anymore. She was a gatekeeper. She drove away from the cliff, the red taillights of her car disappearing into the mist. Behind her, the ocean continued its restless, eternal rhythm, washing the base of the cliffs, indifferent to the rise and fall of kings, waiting for the next story to be written on the sand. The shock was fading. The community was breathing. The monster was a number. And for the first time since 1998, the night felt like it belonged to the living. The Pacific Ocean does not care for the laws of men, nor does it acknowledge the shifting definitions of justice that we cling to like driftwood in a storm. It remains as it was in 1998, vast, cold, and rhythmic, its waves crashing against the jagged cliffs of Oakhaven with a sound that is both a heartbeat and a warning. For 26 years, those waves were the only witnesses to the secret that Marcus Sterling buried in the fog, a secret that sat like a stone in the gut of this town until the very earth seemed to sour beneath its weight. But today, as the sun begins its slow, amber descent toward the horizon, the air over mile marker 42 feels different. The coppery tang of old blood and the suffocating pressure of a lie have finally evaporated, replaced by the clean, biting scent of the sea. The California 1998 cold case is no longer a ghost, it is a closed ledger. But as the town of Oakhaven learns to breathe again, the question that remains, the question that lingers in the long shadows of the courthouse and the empty hallways of the precinct, is not who did it, but how many other monsters are currently smiling at us from the light. If you walk through the center of Oakhaven today, you'll see a town that looks identical to the one that stood here 3 decades ago, yet it is a place fundamentally transformed by the anatomy of a betrayal. The plinth where the bronze statue of the hero mayor once stood is now a quiet patch of grass, a negative space that speaks louder than any monument ever could. It is a reminder that history is not carved in stone. It is written in the blood of the victims we choose to remember and the crimes we refuse to ignore. The community shock has matured into a somber, collective vigilance. The people here no longer look at the badge as a shield against the dark. They look at it as a responsibility that must be earned every single hour of every single day. They have learned, through the most painful curriculum imaginable, that the most dangerous predators are not the ones who hide in the bushes, but the ones who hold the flashlight. Sarah Jenkins sits in her office on the 3rd floor, the late afternoon light casting long, skeletal shadows across the files on her desk. She is no longer the rogue detective or the mental breakdown that Sterling's lawyers tried to paint her as. She is the architect of a new era. But the victory doesn't feel like a celebration. It feels like a weight. On her wall, she has a new map, not of Oakhaven, but of the state, dotted with pins representing other cold cases, other girls who disappeared into the fog, other families who are still waiting for a phone call that never comes. She knows that Marcus Sterling was not an anomaly. He was a symptom. He was a man who understood that power is the ultimate camouflage, that a uniform can be a cloak, and that a position of trust is the perfect place to hide a hollow soul. She looks at this strange clue that started it all, the microscopic genetic whisper that crossed 26 years to scream a name, and she realizes that the future of justice is no longer in the hands of the charismatic or the powerful. It is in the hands of the silent, the objective, and the infinitesimal. The impact of this case has rippled far beyond the borders of this coastal town. In police academies across the country, the name Marcus Sterling is now a case study in the failure of oversight and the toxicity of unchecked authority. They speak of the Sterling effect, the way a single corrupt leader can poison an entire organization, creating a culture where loyalty to the person supersedes loyalty to the law. But they also speak of the Jenkins Protocol, the relentless, data-driven pursuit of the truth, regardless of where it leads or whose career it destroys. The California 1998 cold case solved headline wasn't just a news cycle, it was a revolution. It proved that time is not a defense, that reputation is not an alibi, and that the truth, once unleashed, has a momentum that no politician can stop. In the state penitentiary, Marcus Sterling is already becoming a ghost. Without the suits, without the podiums, and without the sycophants to mirror his own perceived greatness, he is shrinking into the gray background of the prison system. He is no longer the chief or the mayor. He is a number. He is the man who killed a girl and thought he was an artist. His letters go unanswered. His appeals are dismissed before they can even reach a judge's desk. The world he tried so hard to control has moved on without him, forgetting his speeches, erasing his name, and leaving him to rot in the silence he once forced upon Jessica Thorne. It is a slow, agonizing kind of justice, a steady erosion of the ego that was his only true God. He will die in that cage, and when he does, there will be no statues, no parks, and no moments of silence. There will only be the closure of a file. Jessica Thorne's mother still lives in the house with the blue door. She still keeps the garden. But now, when the fog rolls in, she doesn't lock the windows in fear. She sits on her porch and watches the white mist dance through the trees, because she knows that the monster is no longer out there. She knows that her daughter's name is no longer a synonym for a mystery, but a symbol of the truth. She has survived the mysterious disappearance, the community shock, and the decades of deadlock. She has seen the fall of the king and the rise of the light. Her grief hasn't disappeared. Grief like that is a permanent resident. It has changed shape. It is no longer a jagged, sharp-edged thing that cuts her every time she breathes. It is a soft, quiet memory of a girl who was messy, human, and incandescent. As the cinematic camera of our memory pulls back, soaring over the cliffs of Oakhaven, we see the lighthouse on the point begin its nightly rotation. Its beam cuts through the thickening fog, a rhythmic, unwavering pulse of light that guards the coast. It is a fitting metaphor for the work that remains. The dark is always there, waiting for a crack in the foundation, waiting for the moment we stop looking, waiting for the next cold case to begin. But as long as there are people like Sarah Jenkins, as long as there is the relentless, patient science of the future, and as long as we refuse to be blinded by the glitter of a badge or the charm of a smile, the light will continue to find the truth. The story of Marcus Sterling is a haunting reminder that justice is not a destination, but a process, a constant, exhausting struggle against the shadows. It tells us that evil is often mundane, often respectable, and often sits right next to us at the dinner table. But it also tells us that no matter how deep the fog, no matter how many years pass, and no matter how powerful the man, the truth is patient. The truth is inevitable. And the truth has a memory that never fades. The screen fades to black, but the sound of the ocean remains, the eternal, restless tide that washes away the footprints of the wicked and keeps the names of the innocent safe in the deep. The California 1998 cold case is over. But the lesson of Oakhaven will echo in the wind for as long as the waves hit the shore. Look closer, question the light, and never, ever assume that the man who promises to keep you safe is not the one you should be running from.